Hello and welcome to another episode of Frame and Reference. I'm your host, Kenny McMillan, and we have what an episode for you this week. We have what an episode? What? Anyway, we're speaking with Gregory Middleton, ASC, CSC, to talk about almost everything, but more specifically his work on Moon Knight. He also shot, he's nominated for an Emmy for Moon Knight. He also shot Game of Thrones. Hello. He shot the Watchmen television series, which was excellent. He also shot two really great sci-fi shows from back in the day, Continuum and Fringe. A couple episodes each, or one season of Continuum, something like that. We talk about it. Like I said, this one goes long. I almost got it into 2 episodes, but I did some trimming when we went way off topic, and it's at 2.5. You know how to pause things. If you need a break, hit pause. That's what these are for. It definitely worth the time. Super educational, super interesting. Greg is not only generous with his time and his knowledge, but also his expertise. It's awesome. All right, we had a great time. You're gonna have a great time. You're gonna love this one. So I'm gonna let you get to loving it. Here's my conversation with Greg Middleton, ASC, CSC. The way that I normally start the podcast is by asking how you got creatively going, but I understand you were kind of you were dialed into film like right at the beginning, like as a kid.
Yeah, pretty much. I was like, I was quite young. I was like 10, I think, when Star Wars came out, and that was the first kind of like in the theater experience. Just made me like, blew me away. And it became like the window to like, well, how is this done? Like, how are all these weird visuals like created and stuff? Never mind the story. And I was already playing with the family Super 8 camera as a kid. Then a couple of friends of mine I grew up with, we started like there with like Lego models, doing some like stop motion and stuff. And that became we're doing little film tricks, like doing because we were doing in-camera edits, right? With the Super 8 camera, there's no editing. Like we run up to the wall and then cut, and then keep going and then roll again. At that moment, it looked like you disappear in the wall. Things like that. So that was always an experimental stuff when I was young. So then it became, I told the story before once, but in high school doing the same kind of thing with some other friends, and then your high school guidance counselor's like, so what do you want to do? Like, you want to go to college, or what's gonna like where do you want to study? And I was at that point like, well, I want to keep doing this. It seems like I never want to stop playing with cameras and stop making films. And it's a lot of jokes about high school guidance counselors being kind of useless and out of touch and everything and all that. But I got to say, he gave great advice, which is, well, you have sort of 2 choices. You're probably going to keep doing this in some way because you clearly love it. You're started movie club in school, all this kind of stuff. So you want to decide if you want to try and make it a career, or it's gonna be a hobby you do, on your weekends. Like you're gonna obviously keep doing it. And of course, as a young, ambitious kid, you're like, well, it's gotta be a career, right? Cut to, being in the suburbs of Montreal. It's like nobody I knew in film. There's nobody in West Island, Montreal. No one I grew up with. None of the parents are like, what, the film industry? Like, what is that? Like, it's just totally foreign. There's no shoots. It's like, there's nothing like that in any of the things. That all seemed a bit crazy. But, to our parents' credit, they were like, okay, you know what? You're clearly highly motivated. And the one thing that they knew was like being highly motivated and really enjoying something is a good quality to have for something you want to pursue. So they sort of all collectively let us, pursue that. And that's kind of when that started. And then went to university and tried to take film classes, and it went from there. So.
Yeah, it's interesting because out of the, whatever it is, 70 some odd DPs I've interviewed, most of them were interested in film, but didn't just immediately as a kid go, I'm going career. A lot of them were like architects and stuff, and and photographers and whatnot. So, because I was kind of the same way. I went straight for like immediately. It was like, I'll figure that out. Film.
But yeah, they always think you're like, they always say you're lucky. It's like, well, lucky you knew what you wanted to do. It's like, well, I didn't know anything about it. I just knew I wanted to try and go into it. It's not like I had some great expertise when you're 15 years old. Like, oh yeah, I can imagine myself being a cinematographer. Like, I don't even know what the job is at that point. And I didn't, I wasn't a natural photographer. I wasn't playing with like a still camera a lot or taking, it wasn't a photography interest so much. It's just like filmmaking in general. And then in university, everyone has to get to parcel out the roles on a film, and I was a cinematographer in a few other students' films. I seemed to have some aptitude for being on the camera. I had no like real deep photography interest necessarily, but I like the collaborative nature of that role and being like, because you're kind of like right next to the person that, when you're directing and writing, it's like, well, where to put the camera, how to create this effect, and how do we want to. I like that sort of being in that sort of the crucible of that, and it seemed like, okay, well, maybe I'll try and make that like the sort of a career. And I think, or that was the beginning of it anyway.
It is funny because exact same with me, but it's a. Now that I think about it, it's almost like a tolerance for stress. Like director, tons of stress, right? You're dealing with everything. Cinematographer, still very stressful, but narrowed, right? First AC, pretty stressful, but you get to not think about stuff for a minute, Camera operator, stressful, but not all the time. You can do this for a little bit,
Yeah, I remember when I was making my the first feature film that I shot was called Kissed, which was basically made with the school's equipment, like a few years after I'd graduated, by a master's student named Lynn Stopkowicz, who's still a close friend of mine and a brilliant filmmaker. And, it was like a 22-day shoot. It's like an all-student crew. We're shooting 16. But I mean, at that point, I remember she came to me. We were shooting this tiny bathroom, right? And so, when we're not filming and I'm on either operating or being close to the camera when we're doing a take, then we should decide the next setup. Then I'm in there lighting the next scene, and she just came to be like, "Wow, you like never get a break." It's like, because when we're setting up, she can go deal with some costume stuff or think about the next scene. And I'm like, it's like if I'm not watching every take, then it's like, okay, what's the next setup? I have to light that one. It is a bit of an all go thing, but there's a fluid nature to that because you're always kind of creating and solving problems. It's less time. Like stress when you're kind of static is kind of worse, right? Like just sitting there worrying. It's like, that's a way different thing than like, okay, I got 20 minutes. We're behind schedule. I got to do this bathroom. Like, hey, how do I get this shot? And then you have control of what you're trying to do, and you're trying to do things quickly, but it's an active stress, which I think is pretty good as we learn more about, even the medical profession now knows so much more about stress in terms of how, like cortisol levels and being static, like, people that sit in an office that are super stressed out, like have way higher instances of heart disease than people that are, if you're stressed running around doing things, it's way different. It's a more natural,
I believe
physiological state for our body. Yeah. It's like if you're doing it physically, it's if you and I are in the tribe and we're in the old pre-human days, right? We'd be running around, hunting in a pack, right? In a big group of us, then we'd be very stressful, but we're also be in a very optimistic mood because there's the whole nature of us being kind of like, hunting game, that kind of thing is a very cooperative thing. There's a stress involved, but it's not the same sitting there worrying, not having any control over what you're doing. Right. And I think there's a thing about the cinematographer stress where you're still it's in the mode. It's quite active. So I think it helps manage that a bit more, I think, at least for me anyway.
Yeah. I mean, that obviously the teamwork is specifically important to, or I suppose both important to the experience, but also something that people look for. But the problem solving, the active problem solving is something that can become quite addictive for the type of personality that thrives in this industry.
Completely. You can see people that like this can't, I mean, the more I worked, once my professional career started and I started working on bigger and bigger productions, you start to realize the types of people that, end up in those shows and end up in those jobs. And there's a big commonality to that love for the problem solving, love for the sort of team making or being in a team. And they all have to have a little bit of like the joke we used to make. It's like the carnival. It's like, oh yeah, ran away enjoying the carny. It's like, yeah, that's it. You're done. You're toast now. You're gonna spend the whole life now with the carnival running around like a total, like a weird, person who's like left everything behind because it's a bit like that now. Yeah. And a lot of them are brilliant. They're like that. Even the producers. I mean, some of the best, like most incredible problem solvers I know are like amazing line producers and production producers that are really clever about, figuring out the priorities or figuring out like who needs what and what the result will be. Like, this is the kind of thing that's going to help this person excel and which will help the show. And there's a whole layers and layers to that that's really fascinating. And the ones that really care and are really like sitting there quietly going, then they come to you like, Greg, let me ask you about something. And they're like, yes, and I was thinking about this, because they've been watching carefully like how I work or how we're solving a problem. And that's brilliant. That's like, man, that makes the whole, that can make the whole experience like really enriching and really fantastic. And I always learn tons from those people as well. So
yeah, the thing that it took me a while to not get bent out of shape, so to speak, or overly stressed about things going wrong or options being taken from you. And I think it was Adam Savage kind of turned my head on that, which was like, whenever an option is taken from you, that just prunes one of the branches off the decision tree. That makes your job easier. when you're left with like two choices. Now you
Yeah.
just get to go, all right, well then let's just make the best one. Like stop stressing about what you could have been doing, you know?
Yeah.
And learning that little lesson. Oh, goodness.
It's like I just want you to know. I just want to let you know. By the way, Kenny, you have all the options in the universe, and go. It'd be like
the worst. The worst.
Like okay, those constraints are something that's where some of the magic happens, right? I mean, one of my favorite cinematographers when I was growing up, and I mentioned meet him once was Conrad Hall, right? And he used to talk about the happy accident, right? Because lighting can be looked at as a plan, like you're executing a plan, you're designing it all on paper, you're just building it. But it's really a process. It's like throwing paint at the camera. It's like, oh, wait a second. Wait, I didn't think about that. Like, let's turn that one off now and building as you go, right? Suddenly you're like, the composition may be very different than you imagine. You're like, maybe it's better if I just leave this area dark or you're realizing like in a scene, for example, like one of the big things that'll happen that I've noticed is if I have an idea of like what the contrast wants to be, I have to remember like, well, how is my director want to shoot this, or the shot size is going to be? Like, is this a scene we're going to get into close up? Because then if I need a certain layer of contrast or color, I need to have it in here, not just in the wide shot, which may only be in the scene for 30 seconds or 5 seconds or 24 frames if it's on certain types of shows. So then you're like, think about the idea of, okay, well then here's the idea, here's some of the ideas I want this color or this amount of contrast. Then I got to think about, well, where's it going to go? And then it's like, would I place the person? And then there's a lot of that stuff that's a process that I wouldn't have known that until I'm in there, doing the scene with the director. And like, you know what? Actually, this might whole play in the close-up. I watched the blocking. Yeah. Like, even though we're going to shoot other things, my instinct might be telling me I'd be watching. There was something I remember doing a long time ago with on Game of Thrones with Jeremy Pedezwa, who's one of the directors I've worked with quite a bit, and he's a brilliant guy. And there's a scene with Emilia Clarke, and she was Barristan Selmy's funeral, and there's a dynamic to the scene where she's grieving, and the question is in the scene she's going to act out a bit maybe make some bad decisions, which is be part of her theme, right? So she's going to act out against the nobles of Marine at the time, or how's she going to deal with that? And it was a certain amount of like, where's the emotion going to be? How's she going to see it? So she's facing away from the people behind her at the beginning. And, and Amelia's an amazing actress, and I'd worked with her enough at that point, but midway through the season, that I could sort of see, you get a sense sometimes, like when you're shooting, I think for me, when I'm operating or not, like sort of, you watch the actors as the takes go by, kind of like the internal mechanics are starting to work, whether it's unconscious or not, as the performance is building. And you sort of see like, you can sort of see like the gear shift going. It's like, oh yeah, there's, it's amazing. But, I learned this on The Killing, actually, where I worked with the same cast for 3 years, and started to go, it's like, me, Ray, but like I'd be with some director, just do one more. I'll figure out a way why, because I can sort of see when she's about to get out of the top gear and something incredible is going to come out. And I sort of had this sense of that for Amelia in this scene. One of the things we talked about, Jeremy and I, was a specific super tight shot that we were going to looking a bit more of a little higher, and it's sort of a shot that's been used many times before, but sort of feels like the world is a bit coming down on you a little bit. And we've been trying to looking for certain places, what scenes in the episodes, the 2 episodes we had to use this. And this seemed like this is probably a great one. And it's like, wow, this would be a great time for it, because I could tell she's really, it's quite emotional. I know there's a lot there to look at and be very nice and close. And so at the very end, and we were a bit behind, I pushed him. It's like, I pushed the camera right in. Take 5 seconds and do one more take. And Amelia could sort of see us like hustling, and she's like, just stayed there and moved the camera in and did that. And she's amazing. And she's like incredible in this moment. Like a tear rolls down her cheek. It's like, it was like this magic thing to capture. But it took like sort of time to sort of like me to learn how to pay attention that way in some ways, and also have the idea of like, we had some ideas and when do we throw it in, and that's all like a fluid thing, right? It's like the happy accident of like, you have to have some ideas in your head about what you're going to toss around and when you're going to shoot a scene, but you don't know what's there, when it's going to come up. So there's a lot of flexibility to that, and a lot of responding to things, I think, which makes the shooting such an exciting thing, for me anyways.
Yeah, that makes me think, like, was there a point, maybe it was on The Killing, or maybe Game of Thrones or something, but was there a point where you where your sort of natural risk aversion went away? Because I feel like when you're starting out, as a DP, you really try to play it safe or make everything pretty, or like you're trying not to lose your job or whatever,
Yeah. Oh yeah. This is a great topic, because it's because you realize with people like Conrad Hall at that point, like, it's even some of the great masters that I've managed to meet, in my life now, like, Roger Deakins, everything else. Like, Roger's the hardest working guy, and, he's extremely hard working when he's there, because he's just thinking, like, is this good enough? Is this, I don't know. Like, that's how he is. But also in a weird sense, yeah, true. But also he has nothing to prove. He's not like, is this good enough? Like, will people be judging? He's just like thinking for him, it's like, is this the right choice? Am I failing in my effort of creation? Not like I got to look good. Whereas when you're starting out, and I started very, very young, I was very fortunate to be, but I'm like in my early 20s. I looked like I was like 15. So there's a lot of like, well, who's the kid? Why is the kid shooting that, doing this? And so there is a sense where you feel the microscope on you, and you want to make sure you do the job well and properly, but you can easily second guess yourself because you think you're going to be only judged by, let's say, just the lighting, right? And you'd also be judged by if you're quick enough, how you work with the crew, everything else. But usually when you're starting out, you're usually more focused on, I have to figure out how to do this and get this lit, and I'm also maybe not as experienced, haven't figured out how to do certain things. And a director I know just told me a story last week, which is about this, and I was recognizing it was somebody. She was very frustrated by the DP she was working with because like she wanted to do something with a moving camera, a bit more of a wonder in this room, and ended up in the door, and dramatically it made sense, and he just refused because he was like, I don't know how to light that, I can't do it, and he was in that state where he's like, I have to look out for how it looks, right, and he didn't know how to do it, and he wasn't willing to try and figure out on the fly because he was too afraid of not being able to either do it or the time. But he was, he was governed more by the fear of that. Whereas now I find myself like, doing things like with the director, like, what if we did all this? And then afterwards I'm like, now how the hell am I going to light that? right. But I'm more excited about the storytelling content of the shot and the lighting as opposed to just that. And I think it crosses over with a bit of experience. I think the first few times I was doing that, it was more like, you just realize it's not the end of the world if it doesn't quite work out in a certain way. And when that fear of it not, when you're less worried about it not working out, it usually always does work out. There's a certain amount of, confidence you get when you shot a little bit more. And it just took a little while for me to, because I was very, very, like I used to feel the pressure a huge amount when I was starting out, even when I was doing like films like Slither, for example, which was like 2007 we shot that. No, 2008. I was working with James Gunn, and it was like, and we had a $28 million movie trying to be made for $15 million. So we never had enough for anything to do it, and we had a lot of demands, and I had a really big crew. A lot of them were new to me, and it was a lot of, and I was very young, so it was like the microscope was on, right? It was if anything going wrong, it was all obviously my fault because I'm like the weak link. In that context, right? Like that they would look at me as like this small art house DP who's now doing this, almost $20 million horror film. And that was tough. I felt the personal pressure a lot. And I knew a couple of the producers well, and, they were vouching me for stuff like that, but they were easily, there's a lot of room under the bus for people. And I was definitely the person that could end up under the wheel sometimes. So that kind of stuff can kind of wear on you a little bit. But if you persevere and get through it, then like you kind of come across over a point where it's just like you feel a bit freer, right? You just feel like you don't have to prove yourself. Like every setup, like my director friend was stumped that day. That poor cinematographer, he thought like he had to prove himself that day, and he had been asked to do things before and was too afraid of failing that he wasn't willing to take a risk with her. And so it was like self-preservation for him, right? It was less like, and there comes a point where you're less about the self-preservation because you kind of either done it enough or have the confidence to go like, you know what, I'll figure it out. And if I can't figure it out, I'll tell her I can't figure it out, but it's more important that I do that. And I think the thing that made the difference for me was doing some television. I think specifically The Killing, because that show was still like, doing 45 minutes in 7.5 days episodes. So, it's a a lot of quick pace and a lot of really interesting, really great directors. And they were kind of demanding. Some of them are like, well, let's, Ed Bianchi doesn't want to do a lot of coverage. So the shots can be sometimes kind of complicated, but you get so good at being on the fly that you're kind of always on the fly in some ways. And that leads to like, you know what? Then it's like I don't get thrown off as easily. So, I mean, I could not have done the work I did on Watchmen, for example, with the long one-er shots. Like that was that episode, the episode 6 of This Extraordinary Being that's, I mean, I absolutely adored that challenge, and I was working with Stephen Williams like crazy, trying to figure out how to like really get like to block all the scenes and do because I love that part of the process, but I would never been even comfortable even attempting that, 10 years earlier, and that became like a more exciting part of the process than just the lighting. It was like the lighting must serve this, but the camera work was very integral to the journey of the story. So I think the short answer is it was experience. And it was like experience with taking a risk a few times. Like, hey, you know what? I got 5 minutes. What am I going to do now? I've never done it this way. Let's just try that, right? And that builds some momentum to when someone says, Greg, I want to try it like one shot. Like, okay, great. Well, let's just see what have I got for that, and then quickly talk to your crew and figure out, because if you surround yourself with really brilliant people that you like working with, and also, that's a huge resource too. You don't have to have the right answer. I mean, I've many times I got asked by a director for something to do that. I said, yes, sounds great. I like this idea. I don't know how I'm going to do it yet. I'll get back to you in 5 minutes to make sure I know, because, I don't know specifically how I'm going to accomplish that or what the thing is. And you quickly huddle with your operator and your gaffer and your grip and stuff, and, look at the various possibilities and then judge them based on time and things like that. And that's actually kind of, now I'm happily giving that answer. Like we're going to do it. I don't know how yet. So let me get back to you in a couple minutes, and I'll tell the idea. I don't quite have an estimate yet, but I think just taking risks a few times builds a tolerance for it, and then also builds experience to know that it sounds like a huge risk, but it's not. It's like it's a camera and some actors and some lighting. It's not like if I don't connect the nerve in the person's brain, they're going to be blind forever. It's not. It's not that. And I think the frequency of doing that on a series really really helped me. It certainly helped me on the bigger shows, like things like Game of Thrones was like, a very big challenge, but that was cross shooting some stuff sometimes. And we're doing stuff on the beach with like a bounce car in the sun behind a person's head and like, hurry up in 10 minutes. And that's just the nature of like, some of that production, but which is different than what you would think this show doesn't feel like that when you watch it, but there's a perception that it's like, it's all like, it's champagne, strawberries and gold plated toilets. And it's a joke. It's like, you said, no, over here now. And we'll slowly, it's like, it's still a 10-hour day, and it's a lot of complicated work. And being able to be a bit more on the fly is a huge asset. It doesn't go away, like that type of tolerance for risk and trying stuff. That doesn't go away. That goes. I mean, I think of all the great cinematographers that are working now that I admire so much, and listen to them doing some of the films, like the Hoyt Van Hoyt and people like that. They're like, well, this was a way to try and do this, right? Like we got to roll the dice, and then we're gonna try this new technique. And it just doing that. I guess tolerance for risk is built by experience. Just keep doing it, I think.
Yeah. That brings up a couple thoughts I had. One of them being, which is more of like an education question, which is simply just like, what are some sort of things you can do to keep that pace up, to work quickly, especially when having to come up with maybe interesting lighting scenarios or whatever, but also, with a show like Game of Thrones or whatever, or really any of the larger shows, in what ways is it the same as any other shoot, and in what ways is it different? In the sense of like these, like you were saying, everyone thinks you got like $1 million, but whatever. We had $1 million budget per episode or whatever, but that's going to go forever. You can do whatever you want and get every lighting fixture you want. We're in simple situations where you are just on a beach with a bounce card. Like, how do you keep that looking quote unquote cinematic and not like an indie or like a student film, because the student could just go on a beach with a bounce card. What's the difference there? That was 5 questions.
Yeah. Okay. Let me think. What's the first part of that question? Because I can get the bounce card thing. I tell you. What's the first
Jesus
part?
Christ.
Sorry.
First part, dude. I'm bad.
No, I'm sorry.
The first part was just it was risk aversion. Then there was ways to keep moving quickly and still achieving a good result.
Yeah. Well, I think I think it just kind of comes down to taste. It's like this weird thing where, I learned on like in the kind of like one part of the journey of understanding how to, at least how I would do this job as best as sort of I could figure out was, it's kind of like I've got to come up with on the macros. This is making, let's say I go back to a film I did like in 1998. So it's like a $1.6 million 22-day shoot. you have to come up with a plan that you can accomplish, right? Like it's like one thing to say it'll all be this way, but like I still have to shoot the film in 22 days, and I have to come up with a plan, give me kind of what I want in that time, and that sort of part of the problem solving is the same as when you're like, I'm on a beach, the sun's going down, I got an hour. That's sort of the same thing. It's like, what can I do that will still give me the shots that I want? Never mind how we're gonna block the scene out. It's the same sort of thinking. It's like you have to sort of pick a technique that will fit into the time frame, and and that which is a really important thing. And it's also what what experienced directors look for in a DP is they want beautiful work, but they don't want it to be like, they don't want to take away all their time too, right? If they get one take, because I've spent so much time, it's like, and working with the cast, they're going to need 5 or 6 takes to get what they want out of it. Then that's useless, right? Like a great lighting like that has torpedoed the ability to capture performance is not useful to anybody. And that's the thing, going back to that earlier comment about the wonder my friend was trying to get. And so I sort of remember that's the big thing, was like, you know what, I want to do something that's going to give me a certain type of look for this particular film, but I've got to figure out what the recipe is it's actually accomplished. Like, whether it's doing something with like that particular film, which was shot many years ago. It was a romantic comedy, and with a lot of gay and lesbian characters, and we wanted something kind of colorful and playful, but a little bit romantic. And I was like, you know what, I haven't used any real rear nets before, especially in a very subtle way that could give a little something. And it would give us, give you some lighting artifacts. We had a lot of stuff we have some musical theater numbers. We had 3 musical numbers on a stage and stuff like that. All this stupid amount of things to do in a small shoot. But it was a nice recipe. It actually worked quite well. And there's something that would give me a little certain bit of a look that would be a bit identifiable with the amount of with our art direction we were using and stuff. And that was a quick experiment. I was like, okay, now I've got one part of my look is now I've got that built in. That's something I've done now. It's just a question of the lens and that kind of stuff. And that's something that it wouldn't, require. It wasn't like an elaborate lighting thing. It's like I could light very simply, and I could add a nice little glow to someone with using these rear nets. And I picked kind of a warm color net too, like not a classic Christian Dior, which I couldn't get actually, but there was sort of a slightly pinkish kind of color, which worked beautiful on the skin. But it was a way to okay, here's a way for me to add something to this film and in a way which will also not suddenly slow me down. It didn't create the lenses too slow. It didn't, cause other problems. And that's the same thing as the sort of how do I do this scene, in a few shots, right? Like a lot of things on The Killing were, okay, the actors are very good. They usually don't need many takes. We want a certain atmosphere. And then I became better. Like, you know what? Here's one shot, and I could put the other camera here and get him, him or her at the same time. And I could do something because that was my first show with an Alexa, first digital show. And I realized I could do stuff at night now you see way more stuff in the background. Now it's a question of turning things off and blocking things. Now I can create contrast by turning off the street lights behind us or, blocking out with flags or something like that. And then I've got a beautiful, half silhouette soft thing with only a little bit of lighting. And then it's like, oh, that's a recipe. I can do that pretty quickly. It's like, hey, we got to do the scene. We're at the crime scene. I'm like, great. We'll put 2 practicals back there. I learned the trick of putting a small, a pepper or something like that with the sodium color on it. Just put it 60 feet in the background. It'll look like it's a light that's, 200 feet away. And I can do 3 things to help, create more of the mood I wanted. And it's very quick. And I can also, if I'm clever, get a second piece of coverage at the same time, or a second camera can get 2 tight profiles, and we can shoot the entire scene and get 4 shots. We can do that in 45 minutes. And when you're doing that kind of pace, so you start to sort of develop more of these little recipes for that. And that just becomes part of the practice. But it's really about just seeing out what you can do in the time. Like the bounce card thing came up on the same thing, on the same set of episodes with Jeremy on Game of Thrones. We had 2 scenes on beaches. We had a really long dialogue with Tyrion and Jorah. And that took too long to get, and we was in a different location. And we had a slow start for a few other reasons why things were a bit late that morning. That happens. And then and the scene was a bit more of a monster than we thought in terms of number of shots and longer takes. And so then we had a whole other scene where Tyrion and Jorah are on this other beach, and they've just Tyrion wakes up on the beach. Jorah saved him from the stone man and pulled him out of the water, which we don't see. And we had to do all that scene, and we had an hour, and I'm watching the sun, and it's I had this whole idea of
doing
we'll
this
here.
trick.
Yeah, now it's I'm okay. Thankfully there was no clouds on the horizon, so we're gonna get the sun right to the ground. But then we're on this little spit, so we're on we scouted the location very carefully, and we planned some camera positions on the other side, so we'd have water in the foreground to get the reflections. You know, so we had this little spit of water with them. But as far as the coverage, it was like, okay, well now I got to cross shoot some of this stuff, and I got to figure out how I get Jorah walking away in the background with Tyrion in the background, and I'm gonna have the sun in the lens. I'm like, oh well, then you know what? It's gonna be low enough that we can have Ian block it, so we can have him walk up, and we'll just sticks in the slider, which is like, you know, Sean Savage is the operator. It's like, what do you think? Just sticks and sliders? Like, yeah, just that. Don't even bring the dolly. You don't have time to bring any of that stuff, anyways. I brought like one light, and then I brought like just some black and some white stuff. And then I realized, well, if the way I sit them this way, I put the sun between, like that's a simple thing, right? If you and I are talking like this, if the sun's over here, you probably shoot both people fairly well. And so like done that before. It's like that'll get most of the coverage to get the dialogue first, and then just preset the cameras for like moving backwards to get the important part of the scene first, and then the beauty shots will look okay. The lower it gets, usually the sun will be nicer anyway. So, and also it's priority to kind of shoot the performance first. So we shot this coverage first. And then we quick before we moved down, I had Sean built the third camera in the like blinking eye shot, which is like the waking up shot. We used a lens baby, and it was actually my fingers doing it.
Oh, nice.
Sean. Oh yeah, I was like, if we did the coverage, I'm like, just stay here for 1 second, Ian. And Jeremy's like, we got to move on. I'm like, well, just give you 30 seconds. We'll put the other camera here. And Ian just looked down here, like 30 seconds later, got the take, move on. And then we sort of went wider. So like I learned the lesson of like performance first. And then while that's happening, thinking, okay, where's the next shot? Like they're getting this, I'm walking over. Okay, this is gonna be here. Ian can walk here. That'll block the sun. And then, but that's happening. Other camera goes, Dave Morgan goes across the way to set the profile shot. And we get two sizes there. And we'll finish with the camera in the trees with a super wide shot. And we can probably get those in 1 or 2 takes in like 10, 15 minutes if we're lucky. So we sort of plan all that and sort of work out a plan that, I sort of knew would work. So in this case, it was like, lesson photographic is like, look towards the sun, usually looks pretty good. Cross shoot people can look pretty good if they're the right, is not too difficult on their faces. So like all those things are going through the sort of plan in the head, especially when you roll up in the truck and you're like, okay, sun's going down in 1 hour and 25 minutes. DIT stays there. No equipment goes on the spit. We can't afford the time to take things away when we have to get the wide shot. But it was like just making sure that each shot was still going to look nice, right? Like, you know what? Then it's like, how do I put Ian and Peter? Because I went like, Peter, I know we'll be on Peter's shot a lot because it's like he's like, he's came near death, and this is the beginning of like more of their friendship, right? Like they're like Jorah kidnapped Tyrion, and now this is like a little bit more of an understanding. They had and because the next scene they're really gonna have understanding about, because Jorah doesn't realize his dad is dead, and Tyrion's gonna spill the beans to him about that. And so I knew we'd be on Peter more, so it's like I picked like his was a more valuable background, sort of anchored the scene. Then like I think it'll be water behind him, sun off the water behind Peter's shot, and then Jorah will look good. He'll look good, pretty good side lit, and so 2 cameras that way. So he's sort of like, I'm still picking shots I think are gonna look good, and then try and put them in a sequence. Does that make sense?
Totally, absolutely.
But it just takes every single scene is like that in a weird way. It just, that one was like, okay, how long to carry the camera off the spit? Right. How long for Dave to get across the way? And while that's going there, can I get the third camera to where the old crane, which you don't have time to use a crane, to get the wide, that then you sort of, and then it becomes your team, right? Then it becomes Sean and who was our focus player that year? Seb, I think. And they're like, okay, great. And we sort of, then I'm doing the math of like, when you guys are done, you go there. And when this happens here, then you go there, and we'll just keep leapfrogging. And then I know I'll be able to, like, as soon as everyone's out of the way, I know, and I've got the microphone to like my radio to Ian Mars, our DIT. This happening here, and Greg's like, yeah. Ian's like, you could maybe do one more. Like he's watching the exposure, and I want to go shallow, and so that's all happening simultaneously. That's the only way you can get that kind of work done quickly. But making a little plan is sort of the beginning of it, anyway. Totally,
and that actually dovetails nicely into that second part of that ridiculous question I asked, which is making things look cinematic. I hate using the word cinematic because the internet has ruined it, but you know what I mean.
No, I know.
When you do only have a few resources that you're supposed, maybe because of speed or maybe because you're an indie, but at this point we all kind of share the same tools. We can all get a hold of an LED panel that's decent. I love my Kinos, the Astera tubes, whatever. How much of, you're talking about your DIT, how much of that look comes down to the color grade, especially on something like Moon Knight or Watchmen that is quite stylized, like how much of that is in post that you're getting that look, or how much is it just getting an Alexa or having the sickest lenses? Like, can you get away with getting that look with other setups?
I'd say the irony is it's all the things you just mentioned are like 10% of it. So in this case, in that scene there, it was about the location. And the one thing that location was like every way you point the camera looked great. And with the sun lowering down, then it's like how to use it properly. I think the biggest factor as far as like what the word cinematic is when you're scouting, place your scene in an interesting place that like visually supports the scene, offers some interesting visual angles that make sense for the scene. And also is an area which can and also usually importantly offers more than one visual thing about it that you like, because you may not be on the one shot that shows it, but the whole scene. In this case, Jeremy really wanted the spit of land, like the little sandbar, so we could get their spit and their reflections, right? So that's in the shot we knew we'd get. And it's also a nice thing to have. The two of them are now linked kind of thing. It's like there's two of, there's a lot of, they were talking about theme-wise. It's also fairly pretty. But just being on that little spit, it's like because of course we were scouting it and Chris Newman is like, so we think the sandbar will be there in 2 weeks, but it's possible it won't be because, depending on the storms in the lock that might wash it away. It's like, it does move and sometimes it's gone. So we're like, every week it's still there. I'm like, great. So, but I think picking a location and the setting for your scene, because that can affect the lighting in every part of it. Right. And there's like and the irony is like the part of this thing was we kind of wanted, we staged the scene, even though the other scene was in some ways visually, this one was kind of more important. It was the one I want to put at the end of the day because our theme for episode, this is episode 5, was originally going to start with the dawn with Daenerys on her balcony, when it's as if she'd been up all night, contemplating her choices and stuff. And then the sun would be rising, and then this was going to be a sunset, right? And also, it's a thing where Jorah at the end of the episode looks at his wrist and realizes he has grayscale. Like that's it for Jorah, maybe we think. So it's like and so the idea of doing it at sunset was like, for me, was a nice way to sort of bookend that visually. So then we scheduled that way so we could be there late. And also, I'm looking at this location, going, well, we like how this is. Does it work at sunset? And I'm like, yeah, I know where the sun goes down. That'll be great. So I know if we show up late, I know it's still going to look great. I'll come up with a plan for the scene as we did. But more importantly, the setting it supported the scene nicely. It looked great. It was going to look good kind of in any weather. If it was cloudy, it still would have been interesting in some ways. But I think that's the biggest part of it. Like, that's the thing that, drives me crazy sometimes when I see other works, even some stuff I've seen recently, where it's like there's been like no thought to like where the scene is taking place. Like, it's like picking a location is the biggest part of, I think, the cinematic element that you're asking about. And having it also using the environment and the lighting opportunities environment to help the scene, right? Like there was, not to pick on recent stuff, but like there's some stuff with, when Darth Vader and Obi-Wan are fighting in the new show, and it kind of starts in a gray soup and it kind of finishes in a gray area, right? Whereas, if when I was watching a scene,
piles, literal dirt piles everywhere.
Well, and I'm even talking
visually
about
interesting.
The climactic episode, which also
the last episode,
which by the way had incredible work by, and I know people that worked on the show with like Ewan and Ewan and Hayden did a beautiful job in that moment. But in terms of visually, like his ship lands and it's like it's all gray murk, and then they kind of go into a gray area, and it's just like whereas visually for me, it would have been interesting to have it start with something with more sun, or something with like some more and then get to somewhere darker, because I know they want to get somewhere darker because I know thematically I know he wanted to have the lightsabers light it. Now this is beautiful, right? I mean, right. And by the way, those also this is like and by the way, I'm not trying to criticize other people work. I wasn't there. I don't know what they're up against, right? Like there's a whole sometimes I like that plan, Greg, and then they wouldn't let me do it. Like you never know this. But my point is like to thinking about where your scene takes place, like how to use the environment, and if you want to have like changes in scene, like we could start scene somewhere else and then go somewhere else. You could start in the sun, go somewhere dark, or like there's things we'd start in. If you're on the balcony, then you go somewhere more reclusive, right? When the scene is going, you start like in the open daylight on Thrones, and we could get up in the kind of cave when someone's more isolated, or. The cinematic thing is all about using those like tools, right? When you're scouting locations, like really think about that, how to use the place or create the place, right? If like maybe it's a great location, but you need to do one thing to it to give yourself this other visual element to use, right? Like Like, that's sometimes for me, that's I think the biggest thing about cinematic is that sort of planning. And that's sometimes locations are expensive, but if they're outdoors or often, free or close to free, it's just taking the time to be there and then realizing, let's be here at sunset. If we can, right? And also, I knew if I lose the light and I'm doing it at like magic hour, still panic, it'll also probably look okay, right? I'll still get there, right? There was we did a scene in a film. It's a World War I movie called Passchendaele, directed by Paul Gross and starring Paul Gross. It's a Canadian war movie about the Battle of Passchendaele in 1916. And, when we shot in the foothills of Calgary for some of the stuff, and in the sort of home front scene, there's a scene where he's fallen in love with this nurse and he has this long talk. And it was at the end of our day, it was the same thing. It's like, and now we're trapped and we're like, it's went from an afternoon scene to like, we're just going to barely get it before the sun goes over the mountains. And it took a long time to get, the first couple shots, and we only got like 1.5 or 2 takes on Paul, and it's fantastic. And it looks amazing because that time of day can look amazing. But I made sure when I picked the spot that because I'm thinking ahead, like, we could be here late, right? It's the last thing of the day. Who knows what's going to happen? Will it still look good late? Will it look good even if the sun has already gone down? And it plays as a magic hour type thing. Like, I've been inspired by some of Bob Richardson's amazing work on he did some really beautiful stuff like that on The Horse Whisperer. And it, like that, then you sort of think ahead, like, okay, if I get here at 4, it's great. If we have to shoot 6, it's in a hurry, but it'll be great. If we get there and we're totally screwed and we have to do magic hour, it'll still be kind of great. So, you sort of think about the setting that way, right? And that's the biggest thing for making those choices, I think.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, like, and I've said this before on this podcast, like, all filmmaking, all art really is contrast, whether it be lighting, whether it be storytelling, or as you're saying, narratively going from one location to another that are, yin and yang, so to speak. If you think of music, having, I'm a metal fan, but just like thrash metal, that's just one note and a guy screaming, isn't that great?
No, it's like, and scene to scene too. It's like within the scene. That's something that I was so impressed with. Like Jonathan Demme was one of my favorite directors of all time. Who's now passed away, but he worked on The Killing. He did 2 episodes, and he did the finale of the series, and he did another episode. But we had the thing he was so great at was remembering like all the parts of the energy, both the location, the setting, the look, to have contrast within the scenes, and it's particularly transitions. He's very good at like, I'm going to go over here, and then I think the next thing is going to start with, and we're doing it. We come out of a scene, and he asked specifically, he wanted an 18-wheeler truck, because we're in this scene where Lyndon's going to pull over, and then the young suspects in season 4 is going to surprise him at her window and then talk. But the transition, he wanted the very quiet scene. He wanted some energy. So his cut was going to be, we're dolling past the gas pumps where we are, and like basically this 18-wheeler just rushes through camera and reveals all this, right? So it was a hard cut from something very static to it's like, right, and then. And it was such a great lesson. Like, right, all the tools, like use everything. Like he's thinking about motion and sound and the slight shockingness of that cut. And he's a masterful director, and that stuff I find endlessly fascinating, and learning so much about that even now. But that's again using all the tools, right? Like, how do you use all the tools, like light to dark? I don't want to have the scenes all the same color one after the other when they're going different places. I need time of day. Quality of lighting, it should want to reflect the scene, but also I kind of don't want the scenes, even if they have a similar mood, and visually I need to make sure it's like, it wants to be like a nice little journey into somewhere new, like lighting color wise, or you don't want to confuse the audience. It's sort of trying to think about all that stuff at the same time. And a lot of that's location. That's what the big thing is, that the really great directors like, where is the setting? And it's like, I'm not doing that scene up against the wall. We're doing that over, with something that reflects what we're going for. And unless I want it to be plain, right? There's a time for that when you want like just the face on nothing, and the ones that really think about that amaze me the most.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why I started reaching out to more production designers for the show.
Oh yeah.
Just because I've said before, like sometimes production designers or DPs get credits for the production designer's work.
Yeah, absolutely.
The cinematography on that show is beautiful. And you're like, that was a sci-fi show.
Oh, yeah.
Like you liked the set, you liked the costumes. The cinematography was just chill.
Exactly. Very often, great cinematography is mistaken for great production design, and I've certainly been the beneficiary of that many times. And also, it's a great collaboration too, because that's the other part of that, equation for the director is the designer, where you're like, okay, what should this feel like? I mean, Stefania Sella, who'd be a great guest, by the way, she'd be a wonderful person to have on your podcast. She was a production designer on Moon Knight, and she's worked with I want to get the wrong filmmaker who did Black Mass and stuff. She brings some really amazing work, and she's very much like it's like has this one beautiful mix of like, I want to get the palette right for the world I'm making, but like I got to create an interesting setting for this scene, right? Like, where's the scene going to take place? Like there's a really good book on production design. It's quite old, called By Design, which is an interview with old production designers like Richard Silbert and a lot of films in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I can't remember which. I might have been Richard Silbert just talking about it. And he's really going back in the way when you're designing. He's like designing, big proper sets, but listening to him discuss in his interview about, like, he really thinks about the staging of a scene. Like, if he doesn't have a director yet, he's like, what's happening in this scene? Where, this scene is about X, this person's more dominant. Like, he's thinking about the staging possibilities. Like, well, then I put the living room a little higher on some steps and so here, so it could create some levels for them to use. Like, really thinking a lot about what the scene content is, and visually how to make it so that, if I was cinematographer, I've got window opportunities. I've got a lot of opportunities to have the look or have the room feel different. Like, there's a lot of things to just, that have to go into, to making those decisions where it's like, what's this happening in this scene? It's not just a room. It's like, where are they going to be? Who's going to move around? Like, what are the ways a scene might play out? All right. Cause you don't actually know that until your director and your cast are in there. It's a really interesting book. I highly recommend it. It's been a while since I've read it, but I think I read just like, I want to say like when I was in film school, but that was like a real lesson in that. That was the beginning of that thinking, like, oh, right, this is a really big deal. This is not just like, are the colors of the wall right? Like, rule one, how about I don't make the walls the same color as everyone's skin? It's like, and if you want a really like low key scene, do it in a room with darker walls, right? And don't be afraid to make the walls way darker than you think, because I can always add a bit of light, but it gets more complicated for us cinematographers to make walls darker, like, lighting wise. There's some great stuff in Moon Knight where we went with super dark walls in the house that Mark / Steven grows up in Moon Knight. Like, they're like really, really dark, right? But it's really great because it makes for a very easy way to make a lot of mood. It makes him jump out of the background, and it feels like this, weirdly, not weirdly, but this like an over intense memory of like what this was like. It's reflecting his own emotional state of these memories anyway. It's just like, design is like an underestimated component.
Well, Steven's apartment too is even like, gorgeous. It's busy, but not in like a confusing way. It's just, there's like a lot of texture going on all the books and everything. And it's a very
it's like his sort of
kind of room.
Yeah, his like busy mind of like, I love all these things. Like, he's just like a bit of a nutty professor for Egypt, and it's also a giant like loft, right? Like the big pyramid, right. Which was because I think Muhammad's idea was like, let's put some pyramids and everything, and I went and he pressed her on that, and she's like, all right, if you want that, I will design something and we'll figure it out. It'll be like a weird pyramid library. It'll make no sense, but it's going to look cool, and it'll give it that stuff. And she's an incredible designer. And that set was incredible. That was our first week of the shoot, and it was quite amazing.
Yeah. I would love to talk to her. So I've had the privilege on this show of talking to a few people who have worked on, sci-fi shows that I've loved, and I'm being very specific when I say sci-fi, because Moon Knight is not the first show that you worked on where you had people playing two different people. Yeah. So you did what, all of season 3 of Fringe?
No, I only did
most of season. Even episodes.
I did 6 episodes. It was 6.
I think it was 2, 4, 6, 8 or something like that.
Yeah, I think so. Because I'd like the first half of the season. Because David Moxness, who had been on the show before, because they pushed this. He was on a big miniseries that pushed what he was doing between seasons, and so I subbed for him basically on that. So that was just basically me filling in for him. And I don't think I didn't have to do. I did some scenes with Olivia and Bolivia, but we didn't do any motion control stuff. It was all like they didn't interact in my episode, so I didn't have to do the really terrible ones like that. Was like we had to do with Oscar. I didn't have to do that work, but that was a very different thing. And that's, when I look at my work on that episodes in particular, I'm like not nowhere near as proud of my work on that show in terms of like lighting wise and what I managed to do, a couple years later on The Killing, because I was filling in for somebody else. I was trying to fit into the show, and Tom Yatsko was incredibly gracious to have me come in. I'd filled in for him on something the year before because during the Olympics I shot for him for like 3 days, and he liked what I did. And but it was still like a show I couldn't really make that my own. And plus I'm working with an entire crew that I don't know, that I'm trying to get into their rhythm. And I work quite differently than Tom. Like I think Tom does incredible work, but like the way our methods are a little bit different. So I'm adapting to his crew. And so there was a lot of like sort of catching up to do that for that. So it wasn't quite me, getting to like have the kind of authorship that or the responsibility that like the showrunner gave me on The Killing, for example, where, I took over from my friend Peter after the first season, then and made it more my own. But it's a great show. Like, I mean, I there's some stuff in the second season where emotionally, like I remember when the moment where Anna Torv sees that, when they have this discovery of this, people are from the other universe, and she looks up and noticed that what's his name now? Josh Jackson's character's name, who I forgot.
Peter,
yeah, when Peter's from the other side and he doesn't know. And I was like, what a great twist. Like, what a great, I was like, okay, this could be really interesting now. Cause now it's a mystery. Cause now one, she's realizing that maybe she's going to fall in love with him. And also he doesn't know. And that Walter's keeping the secret from him, which is a horrible thing. And it became much more about the characters, which became way more interesting wise. And so when Tom asked me to, he's like, yeah, can you come and do a few episodes till Moxie comes back? But yeah, I'd love to. Cause I mean, what I saw last year was like, this could be really fantastic. This is really, really clever. And they're such great actors. I mean, what an amazing, collection of, a wonderful collection of voices and tones, right? Between Anna and Josh. And then like, you have like Lance Reddick and incredible Walter Bishop, like just listening to them and scenes together. There's such an interesting dynamic of characters, even though there's a lot of, sci-fi talk, and that kind of stuff. It was really amazing thing to be part of for sure.
Yeah, that it was funny because me and my girlfriend both love that show, and we were I only have the first season on Blu-ray, but we were like getting back to it, and I was like, oh yeah, and then we kind of fell off for a minute, work or whatever. But when I was looking you up and I saw Fringe season 3, I was like, which one was that? And I looked at a few episodes, and all of that came back. Like, oh yeah, there's all of those story points came back, and I was like, that show was way better than I remember.
Yeah,
like I remember loving it, but it just all of that had escaped me since the show had come out.
Yeah, no, it's quite that. Yeah, that's sort of like, again, that's weird. Like, I mean, because that was 2011, I guess, right? So it's up to ways now. And then suddenly being this, like, and now there's other, like the idea of like parallel universe and stuff. There's a lot of that going on right now, right? With the Marvel universe and multiverses and different versions of characters. And I mean, it's a bit of a sci-fi trope and it's been done many times before, but it was from a story standpoint, from a dramatic standpoint, it was a very rich idea. And it was, I think I remember Anna discussing with me once about, it was some, like, I think the cast had pushed for that. Like, she has pushed for that specifically, but like, let's just trigger out a way to make these things about us more in terms of like, it's not just, weird fringe thing of the week, like connect it to the characters.
Not the X-Files. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that was really smart. I think that was, because that also makes it makes when you're doing scenes, like when you're blocking a scene, but you're thinking more about the journey for what this means for the characters. It's not just about showing up and like interviewing somebody and blah 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 and just like, yep, I think that's the information, we move on, right? The scenes can have turns in them, right? Because there's secrets between characters and revelations and stuff, which can make the drama more interesting.
Yeah, I had forgotten that I had actually watched Continuum as well.
Oh yeah.
And I went to try to get it, like just buy it on Amazon.
Oh yeah.
Physical media thing, dude. Each season costs like $150.
Oh my god.
I guess the discs just don't exist.
Physical media is not going away, I think, because we're now realizing there's a bit of, even if I want to try and find certain things for reference, like to discuss with a director, it's like you just can't get stuff to some things. It just falls off into the ether and it just doesn't exist anymore. And I think that's a bigger reason to make sure you have some physical media of the things you really love. And I'm a huge fan of Continuum. It's like one of my friends that I grew up with is the creator of that show, Simon Barry. So he was like, we were the ones making Super 8 films together as kids. So I'm super proud of him for that show and the work he's done. He's a brilliant writer and I can't say enough about him. It was a fun thing to get to do. I did 2 episodes with I think Will Waring was my director, and it's just really fun to contribute and be part of that.
Yeah. Well, like I will say, luckily you can get the first season was $35 on Blu-ray, but yeah, all the other seasons. Were
I was trying to find discs of The Killing, and I can't find the Blu-rays anywhere. They only exist in the other regions, so not in the North American region.
Well,
right?
if you get it on Blu-ray, I think Blu-ray is region free.
No, I can't.
No, 4K Blu-rays are region free.
Yeah, but I can't see. There's no The Killing. It doesn't exist on any North American apart from season 1. There's no discs available, which is like I'm gonna find them somewhere or figure something out, because I mean they're on now that Disney owns Fox. Like here in Canada, it's actually on Disney because all the Fox material is on Disney here, because it's one of the few things where they didn't have a Hulu deal or something like that. So the Fox stuff could all be on Disney here, but in other parts of the world it's not. But I mean eventually that might get taken off, right? Then that show will just disappear, which would be very sad for me.
Yeah, long ago I started buying records, like vinyl records, because it was a little bit of hipstery-niche, oh my God, of me. Anyway. But it also, like, certain albums definitely were mastered better than others. Like, there's like, as an example, Sound and Color is an amazing sounding album on record that, when it's compressed into CDs. But especially over the pandemic, I started snatching up every Blu-ray.
Yeah.
I could just feel the losses coming.
I think that collection is worthy, and they also stand up. Like the Blu-ray encoding's quite good. I mean, most people have like 4K televisions now, but they still look really good. Like, I mean, I can compare the files. This is a really interesting off-topic thing for cinematography, but the files you can see depending on
it's all related.
Yeah, it's like what you see or the file you're watching for something. Because now I've got, let's say, a 4K Apple file for a movie, and I've also got it on Blu-ray. Right. And even though the 4K one technically is higher res, everything else, the sound will be better on the Blu-ray. And in some ways, the color will be better on the Blu-ray. Right. And even though it's upscaling it from, the 1080p into my 4K TV, it'll still look better in some ways than the compressed file from the Apple thing. In the same way that, Disney's particular streaming, what they've done with their particular stream has a little bit more color and contrast than a lot of others. And in some ways better than sometimes the copies I get on like just another file you buy it on Amazon, something like that. And like, so The Killing looks great. Like it looks better than some of the other files I've seen. Like used to like on AMC's like all pixelated and all gray and mushy, and the show looks fantastic. Like their particular algorithm that they're using for their stream, whatever, magic voodoo they're using, it's like mostly makes their stuff look really, really good and everything on that service.
Moon Knight like definitely felt like a singular. I mean, it's just Muhammad directing the whole thing, right?
No, there's two other. Originally, Muhammad and I were going to be the only director DP pair on it, and but they learned. I think Marvel had learned on the last couple, because this was their fifth show they'd done. Is that for some of them, it's just too much work for the director to prep the 6 1 hour time. Especially also because each episode's like a movie in our show, right? Like it's in different genres. We're in the desert, like you're in there's a lot of like film style prep to these things. So they decided to sort of to split it up and to give 2 episodes to another director, in which they hired Justin Aaron and Justin Benson and Aaron Moorhead. And so that, which actually I think worked out really well. Cause even at the beginning, Muhammad's like, no. And he's like, Greg, I'm so glad now I'm not doing all of them. Because by the time we were trying to do episodes 5 and 6 near the end, we're all like wiped out. And, and 4 was, quite a bit of work as well. Originally that whole end of 4, when it goes in the asylum, that was usually the beginning of episode 5, but breaking the script for 5 was realizing, 4 had too much travelogue and too much the desert stuff, like cut that out, move that up earlier, leave more room in 5 for the journey, because 5 was like quite a big episode, and so you're figuring all that on the fly. And I think that was, at that point, it was really great to have other creative voices in there to shoulder some of that burden and to work that out.
You actually kind of pinged me off to like a 2-parter. The first part being how, because in Game of Thrones you're juggling a ton of DPs and directors and whatnot as well.
Yeah. On the 10 episode season there would be 5 pairs, like 10 episodes. We'd each do 2 episodes each.
Yeah. So how do you keep consistent? How do you keep the look consistent between all of you? On Moon Knight, I assume it was easier because there was only 2 of you. But
yeah, and also in Moon Knight we were sort of making our look, right? So it was. In which case, like I started before everyone else, those guys, in Moon Knight, I started before Andrew, because originally I was hired. There wasn't going to be only the one team. And so I had some specific ideas I wanted to do, just a few things. Like one of the basics thing is like, amount of contrast, using darkness, things like that. Muhammad was a big fan of doing some continuous shots a lot, and not trying to build things into a shot and not do a lot of inserts. Marvel does like a lot of coverage.
It's not a very cutty show.
Yeah, and I think we fought to get that. I think there's with something where the script is a bit more fluid in many drafts as we were shooting. And I know Marvel does like to have some coverage, like anyone in TV, like even on Thrones, we would do quite a bit of coverage, me and Jeremy, which can take a lot more time. But David and Dan, if they're realizing, hey man, that scene's 7 minutes, I got to make it 5, then they can do it, because if we get good performances and all the coverage, that they can tweak their scene and post as writers, their ultimate showrunner, your ultimate directors on TV series are the showrunners. In this case, in the Marvel case, the ultimate showrunners are going to be putting the final polish, are going to be, the top 4 at Marvel. That they're the ones that are sort of like the ultimate showrunners of the whole MCU. So like they sort of take that showrunner role at the very end, and it's good for them to have some options. And they've learned it's like, we just want some coverage sometimes, because we just want, we wanted the options to do that. And so we tried to give that to them when we could, but we also tried to not make it so we don't have coverage all the time that's the same and like the same style of shot, and we just don't want it to be, because the danger is then it could just become all very visually very similar and right. Too cutty. So we were trying to be smart about how we gave them that. But look wise, there's more contrast. We had some other ideas about color, things like that, and with just me and Andrew working together, sort of like to get on the same page. Like that's one thing. We also work with the same crew, obviously, which is the same on Thrones. You've been the same, and of course on Thrones you have 2 main units. You have 2 different sets of camera operators and gaffers and things like that. But also the show is usually colored by one person, and that's a big factor on Game of Thrones. That Joe Finley would be the only colorist, right? And so he would, and even if let's say myself and 2 other DPs, we might treat the camera a bit differently in terms of exposure, typically sometimes. And so he would be able to even that up very easily, and he would develop like presets for what he would want to be exposed. And I ended up kind of doing something a bit more like him, and we built some new viewing LUTs, actually, me and Joe, for Thrones. It helped me, because the first year I was wondering like, okay, what am I going to look at on set? Because he had some very particular things he did, how he treated the Alexa footage, which really was in quite a big part of the look. It was just how he sort of would bend the curve a little bit. And once I colored my first few episodes with him, I realized, well, this is okay. Now I get it. Now I know why what I'm seeing is what I'm seeing. And now I want to build me a viewing LUT on set, a bit like your sort of base setup a little bit. So that way I'll be able to light more specifically to get where you want. And then it just made his job even easier by the time I get that. So it's a question of doing that sort of thing. But that's a big part of continuity, is your colorist. And the other thing is, it's like, in a weird way, like you just sort of, Thrones is different, because I joined season 5. There's 4 seasons of material to look at, right? And the look from season 1 to season 2, it's a pretty big difference, right? If you watch the show, like we had, Tom Gates would be like, oh yeah, great. We used to have like 200 par cans up all in these sets for these ridiculous, super hard backlights everywhere, right?
And then the Sky panel came out.
Yeah. Well, no, not even that. Then the next season, I think it would Kramer and Jonathan Freeman would be like, now it's like, take all those down. Now it's like 120K to the window, and we're doing a lot of like softer fill light and resimplifying stuff, and also like, how do we get the lighting budget down? And I think it was Kramer was like, yeah, throw everything small into 5K, throw away. Wow. Simple thing. But also it was kind of made sense. So like bigger sources became more natural look, and like more bending into and that's like, okay, more window candle, more of the sort of Rembrandt sort of style, and that they sort of like began to develop in season 2. Which is also something I visually I quite like, and seemed to make a lot of sense for the story. So in that case, we all watched the material, right? So then like all of us who just joined the show were like, well, there's plenty of things to look at. And also all the directors, they did a great thing where they made a little screenshot book. You had like a little book, flip book of like all of the episodes had like a single shot from each scene, which was a helpful way just to like, instead of having to watch the episode, like, oh right, what did the Great Hall look like in this scene? In this kind of context. And you sort of see all the various looks they've done. But the flip side, that gives you sort of like a general feel for the palette. Like, I'm not going to do something that won't fit into this look. But also, you don't want to just imitate that, because you're trying to come up with a look for your scene that makes sense for your flow of the story. So then, it's now you're trying to basically, create something that's the right mood, but you want something to fit within the palette of the rest of the show, right? And so that was something that Andrew and I would sort of begin on Moon Knight, like, well, I want a certain amount of contrast and a certain amount of them. We built a viewing LUT with a lot more contrast than Marvel was used to, which I really pushed them on, and they were a bit, I remember the post guys were like, well, I'm not too sure. And then once we started looking at that LUT on the other material, like, oh, this looks great. Like, good. Okay, good. So we're in the right ballpark. Right. It's been like, and it's also, fitting into their universe, right? So we wanted to be, unique in our own way, but not so far out there. It wants to look different than their other shows, but not like, so different that they're gonna be tempted to like, undo this type of look and then, do it else. So it had to be fit our material. Like in our, we start with episode 1 with a bit of a horror show, right? With Steve being haunted by Khonshu. And then we have a travelogue thing, right? We end up in like the desert in episode 3 and 4. And you've got, sort of Lawrence of Arabia style stuff. And we got, there's a lot of different genres and worlds in it. So but a lot of them felt like they could handle like a more contrast and some more darkness in the image. And also using darkness as a way to hide things, right? Like areas where there is no detail, things like that sometimes, which is kind of unusual for their stuff. It doesn't have too much of that. Most of the Marvel stuff has a lot of, like, you can sort of see through everything to some degree. So that could be different for us, but we felt we had a license to do that with the big psychological element we were dealing with. And so then it was like a color palette thing. Then like, what colors do you want to use? And we picked a certain color for some gold things, which became a gold was like in various parts of the thing. It's in both the Chamber of the Gods. It was in the pyramids, with Mogarts. And then it was like, we can, and I think we're in the tomb stuff. Like, Andrew used it in the tomb for the tomb of, Alexander the Great, right? It's like, that color could work. And then which is also a way of leaning into our more bigger underlying concept that like perhaps everything's in his imagination, right? So it's like then the idea of repeating some colors that like actually will help us with this sort of overall theme and palette of like, because then like red can pop out. I realized, okay, I can use red to the restaurant then, red and gold there, because I'm going to use red and gold and Mogarts like this. If this is all in Steven's imagination, then how you pull things out from that, because there were a lot of things with that visually too. With the things in this is fish tank at the beginning in his apartment, right? Like if you look at the fish tank right at the beginning, it's basically a layout of what's in the Duat later. You've got literally the miniature of the barge in there and the gates of Osiris and stuff. And then because that's like his idea of what that would look like is, as Tauret says in episode 5, these things will be made out of stuff of your imagination in the asylum, for example. But also maybe it's all in his imagination anyway. So maybe the things he would have, all that sort of idea. And Muhammad really encouraged us to use a lot of color as well. Like after a while in the scene in episode 3 where on the felucca going on the Nile, there's all those references to tons of neon colors and like, okay, well, it's going to go really, really crazy with the blues and the purples. And then I'm like, well, I'm going to use some scarlet type color, coming from her side, her being eventually going to become the Scarlet Scarab, and like hint at that color and have him being lit with like her color in the reverse but also do it really saturated wise, which also made her look really lovely. And there's sort of a lot of things like that, and it's like a building process. So we're like, we just talk about these things, like Andrew and I, and like, hey, I'm gonna try this now, or try that now. Or when you're sharing sets together, it's like, I'm gonna add this. I might not use all of this, but I'm having this in case I have to change something. And that's something that's really fun when you work with another DP, is it's like you have different ways of solving problems. But when you're doing a set, you're like, I have to think about not just if I'm starting the new set, like even on Thrones, it's up to me to sort of design what I need for it, but I want to be mindful of like also who's coming after me, right? And then talk to them about like, what do you need? Like, I'm going to do this, but is that okay if I leave this here? Or, you have to sort of because you're sort of all doing a team game, right? Like you want to also, if I know they're going to do something specific for them that's really important look wise, I know to do the same thing, right? So if I'm first, I kind of get first dibs on it, but also I don't want to ruin what they're doing, right? If that's something that's really important. So it's sort of all work together in that,
It's like building a workshop. Like I try to either a workshop or putting a case together or something like that, like an equipment case. I always try to make it so that someone with no experience of my workflow could open the doors and go like, all right, I got it. I can figure this out.
As they say in the Army, built for the average soldier.
Yeah, exactly.
like a bomb proof, or just like, it's funny because one of the things I love about, like, let's say on Thrones, for example, there's like a couple of like nightmare sets we've had or difficult ones. I remember one that was like the tree of like which was rebuilt the tree for where the Dread Raven was, right? And I was like, that was I had a really tough day in there. I had to do this thing and also in this hallway, and I fell way behind. And I finally realized like, well, what I should have done with the top light over Max one side. I was like, you know what? And I was, and that was going after me and said, okay, look, I did this, but I've realized this is the thing I should like, there's one more piece to this to make this really good. Try this. And she's like, yeah, thanks so much. Right. Cause then she's like, cause she's coming in without even less time. And so she's going to use a lot of what I've done, but I'm like, oh, if I could keep going, this is what I I fixed it in post a little bit with Joe's help, but that kind of stuff, great. Or if I was in the Great Hall, I think in one season, right? We in the Winterfell Hall, which got a certain type of look. And I'm like, well, I want to add this one thing. And Tom's like, yeah, we thought about doing that. So we'll add that this year. And it'd be looking down the hallway. There'd be like a little window. And not that they would just leave that, right? And think Annette or someone else like that. And that hallway looked right. I just left all that. It's like one less thing to do, just a bit of the background. Because when you get into these bigger sets, like you're not starting on a show like that, like, oh, now how should I start lighting the Great Hall? It's like, no, it's like crew call, blocking 15 minutes before. We should be shooting an hour afterwards. So all I'm really lighting in is like the shots of the scene, or I'm adapting what we've pre-lit to get shooting, right? So the hard work of like what's out each window or what's down the end of the hallway, that all needs to be done beforehand. And if you're doing it with again, another DP afterwards, like, yeah, this is what I've got doing. And they're like, great, I can leave that. I can worry about my part of the scene here. I think I told the story before, but Jonathan Freeman and I both had scenes in Jon Snow's office in the 7th season where the windows are closed, right? And the whole set was, it's like super dark charcoal walls. The whole look event was made for the first season with like windows open, beam of sun, like that's how you make the room look good. And it's like, well,
happens to be reflecting off the desk,
it creates some contrast, a key light, where the key can be, for the sort of simpler, side lighting that would happen with that kind of thing. And so it's like, what do you mean? Like all the windows are closed. And I'm like, oh Christ. And John was like, how the fuck are we going to do this? Like we both had a substantial page count scenes in there. And we didn't want to do it all firelight too. It felt wrong for it all to be like all firelight. Like how do you, and also it's a small room. It's like a fireplace you can hide. It's tricky it's not a big room. So I did some experiments with like widening the gap between the shutters, right? So if you looked at them from an angle, you could just see a little bit of hot like daylight, right? Or through the thing, even hot, snow light or whatever. And right. that provided like, if I have that in the shot, I can believably make some cooler light from that side, right? It looks like if you draw the sheets closed and you've got like a little, or the blinds closed, you get a little bit hot at the bottom, that sort of idea in a room with, let's say, blinds. And I realized, okay, maybe I could be doing. So I did some tests and stuff, and John's like, okay, good. That looks like it's like you proved it can work. Now it's like I got somewhere to start, right? Because for him, he also had a very big, complicated scene, and he managed to get his stuff staged by the window, which actually really helped. And his scene's really lovely. But it's like that was the two of us together, just like scratching our heads, like this is not something this set was ever supposed to be made for. But we have to come out, and then I realized, if I do these profiles now, I can make them really dark. Like I can make like just like this weird thing where it's just this beautiful silhouette of Sophie and the little finger, and I just make it like, which then it was like an interesting way to sort of like wonder what they're thinking, and using darkness as this sort of like, now it's like a compositional element because I'm literally just looking at a lined face and just like a bunch of like negative space. So all these ideas kind of came out of that idea anyway, and it was kind of originally would look like it's going to be a torturous nightmare. That was like, how can I make this thing not look terrible and not do that? It turned out to be kind of like it turned out. It's one of my favorite scenes I shot that year, and but it was great to do that with someone else together, right? Like it's not like I made it look all one way. We were both like, okay, what will work? Okay, this look will work if I can figure this out. It seemed appropriate for it fits into the world of the show, but it was a way to actually make the scene a bit kind of creepier and made Sophie feel more lonely in that scene, which is part of the game of like that scene is Littlefinger manipulating her or not, right? Is she? And it's like this whole idea of like convincing her that maybe Arya's going to turn on her or whatever, and the usual game of that. So it worked out well.
Yeah, you had. I'm going to add like a part B to the question because you mentioned the colorist a few times, and I over the pandemic I ended up, I wouldn't say becoming a colorist, but I've colored a handful of a few indie features and a documentary and stuff.
What platform did you use?
Resolve.
Okay.
And then I got because I write for ProVideo Coalition, I reached out to Blackmagic. I was like, hey, can I review one of those panels? And they're like, do you just want to take the two? So in my review, I used it to color two projects.
Nice.
And then I was like, I do need this. I will buy it.
That's a great way to review it. It's a better way to actually have to use it on something.
Yeah. Well, and also, as a DP, doing color work made my DP, in the same way that editing can make you a better DP or a director, like coloring definitely was educational. And I'm trying to coax out of anyone I can, like, what is it that your colorists are doing in the grade that are really helping get that professional look? Because certainly you can do a lot of things in the grade, especially with how robust the negatives are, quote unquote negative. You're shooting ARRI RAW or whatever red code. You can push that image everywhere.
Yeah.
So what is it? It's easy to say we make it look filmic, but like, what are you kind of doing specifically in the grade that are making things look professional like that? So especially on something like Moon Knight or Watchmen too. Watchmen looks fantastic.
Yeah, that was Todd Bachner that did Watchmen with me. And like, I mean, for me, the colors is a big part of the finishing of the show. It's a bit, for me, they're a big part of the cinematography team, right? Because it's not something that, I'm finishing the photography, but more importantly, with the way the flow is now, I need an on-set monitor that looks somewhere near what I want it to look like, because everyone's gonna be married to that. In the same way I want the dailies to be very close to what I would like the scene, at least at the time, to look like, because that's what everyone will be staring at in the edit room, and then they're gonna show everybody else. And remember on the Watchmen pilot, for example, they shot the pilot, and then Andre was off doing something else, and they literally just told Todd, yeah, just put this thing on there and do it. And he is like, got no notes from anybody, and it was like, oh, basically Rec 709. I'm like, this is just not what we want at all. And he's like, yeah, it was a disaster. Like, they didn't let me do anything. And also, and I said, that's what they showed HBO. It's like, that's like a travesty. He's like, yeah, I know. And he didn't have any support at the time to like do it, because it was, that's just how the process was at the time. This is not what aired, obviously. This is just, before we started doing the series. So I was like, well, let's back up again. And I want to come up with a palette with, the production designer and work on something like that. So, because building a sort of viewing LUT's a very important step in that process. And as I said, I think before, like that was on Thrones, getting Joe to start getting me specifically some LUTs that were closer to kind of his, because he may also, when for example, like on a series, even with Watchmen and everything else, it's not like a feature film. They don't have 3 weeks to do in 1 hour, right? Like they'll go in there. It's a very quick process. Like I only get 1 day in the suite with a colorist for any show. So at that point, they've done like, the bulk of the work based on my notes and what they want, what they think the show will look like. And I'm still helping polish or just making some corrections and making some overall things or some fixes I haven't, they haven't noticed I want to do. So building a viewing LUT was very important, and that really helped on Thrones a huge amount because, like I say, because of certain specific things Joe was doing to sort of like the way the armor jumps out in Thrones, like you see like a lot like the sky and stuff like that. There's a lot of saturation in the show and a lot of contrast, but it doesn't look. It never looks electronic, right? Like when you put that much saturation in, you do have to bend certain colors away from it that will get out of control sometimes, even with the Alexa.
And pull brightness out. Yeah.
Like pull brightness out and pull so a lot of contrast. And so there was a certain amount of blue skew and green suppression he would do that was like, I can't specify the magic sauce because I couldn't describe it. And also It's also something he's very proud of his own. Like, that's also part of the art he brought to us. Like, I'm going to figure out how to do something that is going to give a unique thing to this and also provide me with a great start that I can know scene to scene in. So, because when he's doing something, if it's exposed fairly well, I can start here, and then he's like 80% there, right? And like so that like would build that, he like maybe 2 or 3 versions of that or whatever, and that allows him to spend the time for the finesse. And he's not like starting from the log. Okay, like he can't do that at every scene, right? When you're doing a show that quickly. So and that's a big thing about. And so the idea of if I can get something like that he starts with as a viewing LUT-ish, in that case, then I want. In the case of Watchmen, I'm building something that I want in terms of a viewing LUT. Like I'm designing more from the ground up in terms of that, because it's not just something that exists so far. And that's the first step. And then I know that we'll get pretty close. And if I can make the dailies look pretty close to that. And then, in this case, it's Travis that colored Moon Knight. Like we know he's pretty great, and he was very, very flattered with flattering for the photography that Andrew and I did, because for him was like, wow, this stuff looks, it's almost like it's done. Like he's not having to go from ground up and go like turn day to night and like, because both him and I more of coming from a film like a more of a feature film style of like lighting wise. Like I want it all in the camera as much as possible, and I'll say the things I need to fix later, but. From Travis's standpoint, and he's been on a lot of shows where like they just don't have the time like that, and it's like you're starting from scratch, kind of like now I got to build more. Scenes are all over the place. You're just changing stuff between the scenes. Whereas Andrew and I were quite consistent with very similar tastes. Like anything, slightly different methods at times, but we we had an idea where we wanted to get to, and the daily stuff we're like, wow, now it's like a few things. I think the thing that in terms of like the general taste things are, if I can see some in my mind is like a sort of electronic treatment of colors, or see stuff that's a bit too, if I see a lot of color in the blacks, that I find really tricky, because then it bumps between scenes. Like, for me, the stand, like, if the blacks are consistent, like, neutral, non-color, and a lot of the whites have the same way. If you contaminate those two things, I find it's very easy for it to feel like you're watching like traffic or something, right? Where everything's like has a hint, like a hue on the whole thing. I find that if you have a hue and without a lot of color contrast, I find your brain tunes it out after a while. In this case, the sort of idea of this palette kind of gets neutralized in people's brains, right? It kind of goes away unless you're going back and forth a lot. So I try and generally stay away from like an overall hue, because I find that just when it gets tuned out, and it eliminates the ability to have the feeling of it. If you can have some color contrast within the scenes, then people notice the color. Do you know what I mean? If you've got like cool light on a person, you got something in the background that's not, then you'll notice the cool light. If the entire scene is cool, eventually it'll all start looking gray to them, right? Like this is how our brains work, right? Because our brains, it's like anything, right? You acclimatize to what's there. So I think using more color contrast within shots, or having some contrast, I think is, for me, something that's pretty important. And so a grade that will make sure that that's possible, I think for me, is very important. And like whatever contrast range and gamma stuff you do, because I think that's what allows you to have some use of those other tools, right? To use the whole spectrum of things, you need the audience's eye to be able to have that. And if it's all one color, then you would literally, unless you're going to like a red lit room or something like that, you don't need something else to remind you it's red. But it can too easily just like get tuned out. So if I have anything like the last, few years I've been more keen, and I think that's also what Joe was doing, right? Joe let for a lot of saturation, and it did two things. One, it kept like the green from getting too electronic, right? Because the green trees too much. But if you looked at the armor, like the colors, like of let's say, like the armor will have like a patina to it of a certain thing, right? But it'll be kind of reflective a lot. Let's say Brienne's armor or something like that. But you will see the color of the sky in it, right? Because there's a lot of saturations. The blue will still read through, which suddenly gives, now the armor's got like three things going on. It's got like a white sky, it's got some blue, it's got the brown of the patina. So you have like a lot, and it has dimension. Like suddenly it's like, it really jumps off the screen. And then you realize like the next to skin tone, it's great. And because there's a coolness to the shoulders and the thing. And so you have all these like layers of color, in this image. And, what's interesting thing about Thrones was the costume designer, and especially at the beginning of the show, and everyone else, they're very smart to, like, in a shot like this, so a lot of the show is like 40 mil, this kind of size, you needed to be able to know everything about this character, which means there was a sigil of some type for their house, right? Because if you didn't know, there's so many clans at the beginning of the first show, you're like, who's who? Like, who the hell? But you start to see that like everyone's got their own kind of color scheme, and it's all in shots like this, and there's a little sigil, so you start paying attention, like, the
Harry Potter effect of every clan having their own color.
Yeah, own color, or like Littlefinger has a little bird, that kind of stuff, or there's always there's a wolf and Jon Snow at the top of his breastplate, and then I think when a big part of, I might ask Joe about this at the beginning, he said, well, the one thing is he needed all this stuff to really pop, right? Because it's like you don't want them to miss this, because eventually they'll start realizing, oh yeah, right, he's got the wolf, that's great, so he's part of the Starks, right? Okay, good. And so he needs that stuff to really pop out, and the designers are very good about using some color contrast in that. But Joe was like, I need to make sure this stuff really jumps off the screen, and that was a part of, I think, his initial concept of how he was doing that. So for me, having the ability to have color contrast is really, really important, as far as like that range, and then also just like where you play the brightness. We have a whole nother range now with HDR, which is a whole nother world. It's like,
right,
we're just getting to grips with now a little bit, I think, right? This is the second HDR finish thing I've done. And we had an HDR monitor on set finally, but it was still a studio monitor, because there isn't really a location monitor that can actually show the full range.
Was it one of the Canon ones or a Sony one?
No, it was I'm trying to remember now. The Canon ones couldn't quite really show the whole range. It just couldn't show the blacks, and so you had like two modes you had to use. But I can't go back and forth when I don't have time to do that. But I'm trying to remember which one it was now. I'll have to look it up. And it was a humongous studio monitor. It was like a 35,000 euro, monitor. It was like this thick and this big. It's a CRT one, but
or Flanders maybe. Oh, it was a CRT. Goodness, that was
yeah.
probably Sony then.
I think it might have been anyway. But when with the beginning of like, in the scope of the Moon Knight post process, like the thing is they, of them, because this is part of also Marvel also beginning to understand how to make a 6-part show as good as quality of their movies for a third the money and like a third the time, right? So
right,
and I
that'll
prefer
lead us to the next question.
Oh yeah, so but in post, right, the first couple shows they did not have an HD monitor on set, and when SDR, one of the big things that happens between the two, as is like there's more detail in the highlights. Well, if the window behind you is now blowing out, for example, and you're sort of the thing there a little bit, and if we're doing that, and I'm fine with that for with a little part of the scene I'm on, but that blown out level will be different in HDR and SDR, even depending on where you sit it. So if there's things out there which are gone in the SDR, they'll suddenly reappear in the HDR, and that became things in there. So they're the first show. I think they're like, okay, we have to not do this because now, when in the post pipeline, like the delivery, by the time they're noticing this, the effects are being put in. It's like right at the very end, and it's a huge nightmare to get to add suddenly more things to fix. So they're like, okay, well, how do we don't want to prevent this problem, so we need to have an HDR monitor on set. Well, then it's like, what can really do it? Only a studio monitor. I think the DIT on WandaVision, like he bought one, but it's super expensive, and they don't handle the heat, and they're really, we generally didn't take them out of the studio. Like they didn't go to Jordan. I didn't bring them to Jordan in the desert. Right. But that was a way for them to kind of like the beginning of their process of how do we cut down on this problem? We don't want to be surprised later. So it gave me in a way like, hey, if I want to blow out, well, one, I don't care if I see a bit detail, but I don't want to, a C-stand there or a traffic cone or like, the kind of stuff in SDR that might just disappear. And that helped solve that initial part of it, because their post pipeline is very, very compressed, right, compared to what they're used to doing. And, the VFX are all coming at the end part. And like I said, like in the TV thing, the showrunners are the last people to really, have the touch on it. So the last people will be like, Kevin and Victoria and all the top people in Marvel and as it should be, but they don't want to be suddenly dealing with extra problems that will only show up in that last couple of weeks. And so I think for us, like our show got colored really well, and Travis and all the people that coordinated that, like Morningstar and everybody, were really wonderful. And we headed off a lot of those problems early. So I think we got a really nice grade, and Travis did a beautiful job, because Andrew and I put a lot of effort into making it as good as possible going into that process. That we didn't have too many like sudden problems, like, ooh, like, oops, I didn't expect that. Like, so deal with just the normal things. Yeah.
That was actually one thing that I was going to ask like right up front, but I'm glad we're getting to it now. Marvel has kept all of their films and shows remarkably consistent. Look wise, you can kind of tell when it's a Marvel production. What are some of the things that they're sort of, I don't want to say mandating, but do you have an inside scoop on kind of how they're managing that and kind of what's the mark? Because like when I used to work at ABC, and all the ABC shows were pretty consistent looking. They all had kind of the same simple sort of lighting setups. And I remember talking to Joanna Coelho. She did The Rookie. She was like, the one thing she told me for sure was like everyone, you had to see everyone's both of their eyes. Everyone had to be, which is a little old school TV.
None of this.
But
that's not allowed. Yeah.
No. But yeah, so what is Marvel kind of handing down to you guys that's like keeping that consistency and keeping that professional, kind of look going, I think, and all that?
Well, I guess one thing was when the beginning of the, like, okay, we're going to build a viewing let for the show. I'm like, that's what I wanted to do. And the first thing is like, well, I guess I'm not going to start from scratch. So, well, here's just something I used I made up on the show. It's like, well, let's look at
the continuum LUT.
Yeah, the continuum's not going to work. It's like, or they'll show different cameras, but the part of the thing is like, well, what are the LUTs for the other shows? Rather recent show. I also think about the other, because they of course have all those, right? And they have a whole pipeline.
Of course they do.
Yeah, I'm like, So it's good. Yeah, but this is like part of the process, right? And I was sort of like, well, I was expecting this. So Mike Maloney, who was the head of color, their color department there, and he's kind of like, Greg, it's and those guys were. I mean, I can't say enough about how nice these people are. I said, Greg, by the way, the HDR thing is new to us, and we've had a few bumps. I just want to let you know that it's not perfect yet. And it's like he's trying to brace me for
you may be very frustrated with how this is going to go initially, but we're working on it.
We know.
It's like, I know I'm going to tell you, like, so.
Well, it's like what you said, we're going to do that. I don't know how yet. We'll figure it out.
Yeah, he's like, we're just getting that. We're getting better at this now. We're on show 4 or whatever, show 5. I'm like, we're just getting there. I'm like, that's no problem, right? It's like, he was just more like, he's thinking like, oh, please don't be, so upset when I can't just tell you exactly how all this is going to be done and why I can't deliver to you on set exactly,
right.
That sort of thing. But but they were pretty far along as it turns out with trying to figure it out. So my first thing is like, well, let me look at some of the onset LUTs for a few of the shows that are similar in contrast to, I think, where I want to go or a bit. And then I could start working with those because they're like, we're not going to let you like come in and like, I'm not going to have a LUT that's going to have a lot of color in the blacks, a lot of, like, that's not going to happen. Like, that's not going to fit in their world. Like, we can look at that, but they will grade the show somewhere more in the space that they're at, which usually involves not a lot of color in the highlights or dark areas, which I was fine with. I was just wanting for more saturation and more contrast, right? I didn't really want to push that other thing. And so I looked at a bunch of their other LUTs, right? The last couple things, I can't remember which ones they were, like one of the Avengers movies, the Hawkeye LUT, which was a bit more, that's probably the most contrasty one they'd had at the time. And I was like, okay, good. And I want to look at more things. And they had, to one thing to evaluate all their things, they have their own test chart, like a Marvel test chart. I think, what do they call it? The Marvel Marcy, which is like basically a whole bunch of like stuff from the palettes of all their shows. It's like toys and poster stuff and, a lot of stuff that's really like, these are like, I mean, the thing about their brand, their show is like, I mean, Spider-Man's gonna look like Spider-Man. So putting an all orange light is like, that's fine for a scene occasionally, but like he's still gonna look like Spider-Man. So they're not really gonna want to watch a show where he's all orange and like either wrong color, and which will mean like for the colors, they're like, well, then what happens is then we're doing that, and then we're rotoing him the entire time, and they're like, and that's like, there's one of the big lessons was, certain characters will look the way they need to look, like as much as possible. Like, Captain America's shield is going to look like that shield. So occasionally there could be other light around, but we're not going to suddenly make like, we're not going to let it look green by mistake. So and that's why that test chart was very important. Like, so if you throw it on here, how does the test chart look? Are we suddenly building a LUT that's going to make all of certain types of colors in the palette of the various costume stuff like be too bent out of whack, right? And that's it's a very smart way to do that. And so we went for quite a neutral one that we're building. I just went with a lot more contrast, and I know they're a bit worried initially. It's like, that might be too much. I'm like, well, let's put it on the test chart. Like, I mean, I had enough experience with your Marcy. Well, that's then they loved it. They're like, it looks fantastic. It's like, because I had more experience with like more contrast your LUTs than they're used to looking at, right? Because they do look. There was one thing too, again, about what you get used to is, as I said earlier, it's like your brain tunes stuff out, right? So and some of the viewing lists were much flatter than I would ever want for our show on this thing. So it was like, there was a lot of them that were quite like flat, just because also their big thing is also they want a lot of details. They want to see everything, when they're in their edit, they don't want things buried. That was a big part of post-process for them. You're not doing 7. Yeah, they don't want to like not know what the hell's in there, right? And part of it for me is like, if I would build a heavier LUT, then the thing is, like one that has more dark, like more contrast. I know from also my experience on Thrones, where like I'll happily make that LUT fairly, like make it heavy, meaning like there'll be a lot of detail in those dark areas, right? You'll be able to dig them if you want, but I don't want them on set to look all murky, right? Because I want to have the contrast, because that's going to allow me to light to the kind of contrast I want to have in the scene. If I can never make it dark and I have a very flat LUT, then guess what? I'm going to underexpose everything like crazy, because that's what I'm trying to get areas to be dark. So if I want to have a dark area, I want to be able to have some black. I want to make sure in that black there's actual detail, even though on set on the LUT it's going to give me that darkness. Which one does two things. One, it means when they're doing visual effects, you're not like pushing color into where there's no signal, which is what can create a lot of noise. And two, it gives them the confidence to like, hey, you know what? It's contrasty, but I'm not screwing them over the ability to. It is their show in the end, and I don't want them to like lift everything, but I want to not do it in a way which I'm destroying the image to protect this concept, right? Like, it's not, I should win the argument over the contrast of the scene by like artistic merit, not by forcing it on them and just be like, you can't do anything about it now. I've underexposed it so badly. That's I don't really, I prefer not to work that way. That's not really a useful, collaborative method with people. And or with anyone. So the idea was to build something more contrasty like that still had detail in it. So then there's a scene in episode 1 where like Oscar's in the elevator when he's been chased out of his apartment by Khonshu, and there's a shot where the door opens and it's like just this window, just like a little like the thing, and it's just like all black, right? And there's detail in there, like it's not down to nothing and usable. I mean, but that was like the whole point, was to have a shot like that that's possible. Whereas if it had been a much flatter LUT, I would never. Then I'd be relying on later making that dark, and in the dailies and in the edit, it would have been all murky, right? And I didn't want that. Right. I wanted it to be black. So there was a purpose around that design, and so that was the big part of that. So basically, using some of the base LUTs they started, like building from those. Oh, let's start for this one and experimenting, but I couldn't like show up with a new one. And having their test chart was very smart. I mean, that's obviously something that that's something that would come up early on. It's like, oh shit, now Spider-Man looks wrong. Okay, we got it. Or whatever character, like whatever ironic thing. It's like, yeah, we got to make sure we don't do that, right? So
it's such a no duh thing, but of course they let each of you like ape each other's LUTs and stuff. Like that's the easiest way. Because in my head I was like, what? They just make you use Alexas? Is that it? It's like no. I mean, for me, I picked that camera because I'm also most comfortable with that sensor, and at the time, and like I can't wait to try the new one out, the new Alexa. I got to goof with it a little. It's nice.
Yeah, I mean, I think I know a lot of friends of mine that really enjoy the Venice. I haven't really done a whole show with the Venice.
Venice is fantastic.
Yeah, and I haven't really worked out like how I would treat the onset, the LUTs yet and stuff like that. I haven't graded a whole thing. Anyway, so for me, I was like, well, if we had to use large format, which we did to get the resolution what they wanted, so we used mini LFs, on the show, but I know the sensor more easily. So for me, it was a little, like, I know kind of where I'm starting at with like building a LUT. I know if I get into this kind of range exposure wise, I know I can get myself more comfortable with that. I meant so much to learn on this show anyways with, working with Muhammad and the new thing and Marvelous. I didn't really want to throw in a whole new camera at the same time. So, but that was really useful. And also great.
So nice.
Yeah. Well, it's also the thing is like also with Marvel, like they own those LUTs. It's not like they're, it's not like I have to call up Eric Steelberg. Eric, can I have the LUT for, Hawkeye? It's like, no, it's like, trust me, they have a whole color science department and it's like, they've got them all. And they were most comfortable if we started with something and could build something based on a few things they already have. So they just don't want to get caught with some unknown problem later. Like it's all great, except, the purples are always going like now they just don't want to, they want to not have too many unknown complications when they're finishing their shows.
So what were you, obviously it's different for every scene, but in general, kind of like what were you lighting to, like what was your key and like how dark were the shadows getting if you were letting that LUT kind of boost the contrast? But
I really couldn't tell you. I mean, I think,
fair enough.
Let's say let's look at the non HDR space, IRE meter kind of thing. That if I use a leader false color thing, it's something that I
totally
was, which is something for me. It's like also start to know what the colors are, kind of like that in the quickly thing. Like a skin might be like a Caucasian skin might be at typically in the sort of like mid greens kind of thing, and then all the dark stuff would be like the medium to dark blue, right? Which I would set that level at like 10 or something like that, or 11. So anything below that would be black. But of course, it's still detailed down to 0. So that way, if I'm in the blue range, I'm in the 14, 15, 16 kind of range like that. And that way, there's plenty of detail. But it can look on the screen, the LUT, that can look very, very dark, if not close to black. So that's sort of range kind of thing. And then, skins in the high blue kind of like, mid-green kind of thing, which is like 38, 40 kind of thing, or a little less than that-ish. But I don't really think about those numbers. I'm just more doing it by eye. That's for me, that's the thing about the LUT is it allows me to sort of, once I get used to seeing that and getting my eye at it, then I'm just on set, I can kind of get it. And then I just do it by eye, and then I can have my, if I'm at the monitor, for example, I can just sit there with the remote iris and get it, kind of right where I want it, the exposure kind of as close as possible to what I want, and doing that more by eye. I find that a quicker way for me to work. I'm not thinking about ratios or measuring that kind of stuff. Like, I'll sometimes use my meter to sort of start a scene, or to, in an environment where I'm using the stuff that's there, depending on what the day's been like. Let's say I've been out in the sun all day, my eyes are maybe not going to be as tuned to knowing what that is. So I'll use my meter to kind of get the framework that way. But if I'm in the studio and I'm kind of getting more used to it, then it's like, I'd like to be able to do it by eye as much as possible.
Well, the main reason I asked, honestly, was for selfish reasons, because I kind of needed a sanity check. I've tried to sneak that question by a lot of DPs, and they kind of don't give me the exact numbers or whatever. But it's mostly just like exposing digital, especially depending on the camera, can sometimes be weird. You know, when like the Alexa and my Canon here, and you know, they both suggest like, oh, put skin at like 60.
Oh,
and
yeah,
it's like,
way too high.
And it's way too high. And I started doing it like at key, or like you said, a little under. And I'm like, wow, this looks way better. And I'm like, I have to remind myself, like, that is what the engineers said.
Yeah.
Not what the artist said.
Well, also like skin at 60, like what's in the rest of the scene? I mean, skin could be fine at 60, but like, I mean, if your skin at 60 in that room, like you're going to lose you'll probably be too high in the back, you know, your background than you want, like for grading possibly. Yeah. Right. So, cause then that whole thing would be 60, 70 high, like, right. If your skin's close to the back wall, then you know what I mean? Like it's more about the range of those things. And for me, that's where the viewing LUT comes in. That's so important, right? Cause then I'm looking at the contrast between
turn off
things.
The LUT for you. Oh, where is it?
It'll just go all milky.
Yeah, let's see, off. So there you go.
Yeah.
So there's still, like you were saying, in the HDR, you would still keep all of this.
Yeah.
All of this for the most part. But
and also that's an interesting thing is that you know that in that Canon space, like that you know that log, that no LUT thing is really narrow. Like it's all, you know what I mean? And that's the thing I liked about the Alexa was, yeah, it's flat, but there's more, you know what I mean? Like, whereas other things confuse me, like in some of the Red camera stuff, like everyone just goes whoop, and it's like, it's so narrow that I'm like, I can't see anything about the difference between these things that way.
Yeah.
Where a LUT becomes even more important, I think. So I don't know. It's an interesting question. I mean, I would never go by that the engineers can say in that context, but it's more just, and also like grading the stuff is what really tells you, right? Like if you, the bigger danger of those things is, like I think with a format like that, for example, they're saying 50 or 60 because the biggest problem with those cameras will be the bottom will fall out when when you're grading stuff in the bottom, and so they don't want to make sure you don't underexpose, because that's more the common issue that will make the material not look good out of that camera. Whereas maybe it handles highlights particularly well, or they know that at least if they're burned out, they don't look bad. You know what I mean? It could just be a simpler thing of like what will give them a more positive. The customer's a more positive impression of our camera,
right?
Whereas, you know what I mean? But like, I think like, you know, it's easily on Thrones, faces would be kind of like in the mid greens area, so like middle of the curve, slightly below the bottom, depending on the skin. But also we'd have a lot of contrast, right? So have a lot of darkness and stuff. And I think it was similar. I think on Moon Knight, the LUT was pretty heavy. I think, you know, and sometimes like we'd turn it off, like some of the night scenes where we just didn't have enough light, or we just crank up the ISO a little bit, or just, you know, make a tweak. And we certainly made tweaks for each scene, I think, in Moon Knight a bit more, like the Asylum, you know, which Andrew had shot the first scene.
Asylum looks great.
Yeah, but he made some tweaks just to pop the whites a bit more, just to stretch things out a little bit more high end contrast, and we'd make little things like that for some of the night stuff. But it would start with our base and just like tweak it a bit. And that was without, you know, going too far off the rails.
Yeah. You know, I kind of another two-parter. I'm just noticing I had written all these notes down. And then, Jesus Christ, I got to let you go. We've had you far long.
Well, yeah. Oh my God, it's 5 o'clock already.
Yeah. Yeah.
I tend to give long answers, so I apologize.
No, that's fine.
I
tend to keep going until I have to remind myself, like, these people have families and jobs, versus me just sitting in my girlfriend works till 8:30, so I'm just sitting here. But you know, with sci-fi and fantasy films and stuff, it can feel like maybe they're harder to light or harder to shoot. Do you find that true? Or in what ways do they differ from a more, let's say, realistic genre?
Well, I guess it depends. I mean, one, you get different sources. I mean, like Moon Knight, for example, we had a lot
plus the stereotubes. Yeah, was the second part of the question.
Oh yeah, stereotubes were like, that was the, if I had those on The Killing, oh my God. But we're using like Kinos a lot, and then you're like, on the old days we'd have like the Kino, and then we'd like, okay, to get because the Killing was kind of the opposite of Thrones. I was shooting very, very, very under. So the idea was to use, because the big danger or the big concern then was like the top end looking wrong to a film curve. So it was like, I just want to make sure that I want to save as much top end information as possible. So we're going kind of the opposite direction. I mean, there's some scenes in the killing, there's some stuff in some episodes of season 3. There's a scene I really love in what episode is it? It's the one where she's kidnapped in the car, directed by Lodge Kerrigan. I can't remember what episode it is. Like it's episode 8, I think. And there's a scene where they end up in a parking garage, right? And he drives her in there because he's kidnapped her. She's driving. He's got a gun to her, and he's in the back seat. And they go into this garage, and then they turn out the lights. And I'm like, okay, so now I got them sitting in the car by themselves, and I'm like, you know what? Now I'm getting better at this sort of idea of just putting a little hint of light on a concrete wall, but I've got them sitting in the car, and I've got them sort of edge lit by like this nothing light over there, and it's just black in the foreground, but I exposed it super low, so it was like, I mean, it was like if you hit the waveform, everything was like, everything was all like down here. It was like this little bump, like the top of my hand, right? This little tiny, and but it worked really great, and the grade we managed to clean it up, and I'm super proud of that scene. But back to do that kind of low level, it's like, well, how do you and this is like, we have no LED lights, there's no sky panels, we're not dialing things down like percentage by percentage. You're like, put in a double. Oh, that's too much, right? Back the light up, add more diffusion. So you have all these tricks to do that. And one thing we do with the Kinos, which we did with Owen Taylor, our amazing gaffer, was like, well, we just put, when the 4 things, we put like one tube with because they have high and low, right, on those right. Ballasts, or if you're lucky to get those ballasts, and then then we put like one tube with like N6 on it, one tube with N3 on it, and the tube without, right? So with that step, you could go like, okay, half power on the 3, and then full power on this. Like you could create 5 or 6 little brightness steps
instead of dimming them.
Yeah,
because the dim would fuck the color up, right?
Oh, completely. Yeah, we couldn't. I mean, the Kinos wouldn't dim. It's just like you had on, off, or like whatever, half power, full power.
Mine would go so pink. I just traded them in for the LED panels. And for anyone listening, the Kino LED panels, I have a color meter, one of the Seaconic, the new ones.
Oh yeah.
I have gotten 100 TLCI out of the Kino LED panels. They are shockingly accurate.
That's a bit better than the Celeb way back then. So
yeah, a little bit.
It was like, we have all these tricks to do that, right? To like try and create the brightness that we want. Because I mean, at one point, like, we're doing such little stuff, like I'm taking a tube with like, snow blanket stuff on, like that white insulation thing, and we're bouncing it into a car.
You put around like Christmas trees.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We'd wrap a tube in that, and then like you'd be careful because it can get them too hot, but it'd create a nice fall off effect as a way to sort of like, and then we're like bouncing into a card and like, making a little book. I mean, it was getting to ridiculously low levels, but the work it worked out really well. But I'm sorry, what was the question about the first part?
It was the difference between lighting. Actually, this is kind of more where I wanted the conversation to go anyway, which was just the talking about different sources and stuff.
Yeah,
sci-fi
science
versus
fiction.
regular, but even talking about sources in general is like interesting.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, in science fiction, you can get a lot of built-in lighting, which can be really interesting because that can be like a self-lighting set is a fascinating thing to try and help to build.
Like the Expanse.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Like I mean, with the work Jeremy did on that, and also the Expanse is also not just self-lighting sets, but I'm going to shoot everything with like a 20 mil lens, right? And there's with Cook S5s and like, and it was, but also that's a great way because then you're thinking again, about like the mood. You want to think about the mood you need in the scenes, and also like how you can vary the mood, right, with the built-in lighting. Like you've got, from the desks, or like you start looking for places for sources that would sort of fit the design, but also, or either build them in exactly or cheat them from, right? So, and then also you can work very quickly like that. So the big thing is the types of sources, and it creates a lot of conversation about like, par bulbs or like, tubes or whatever you're going to use, things like that. And there's some amazing new stuff out now, like those Astera, like those little Astera spotlight ones, like the AS5s and the AS7s, which are like these little like small.
Oh, yep.
Yeah, those because they also have amazing
color
color
response. Saw those at NAB.
Yeah, they're like, I mean, I remember the digital Sputniks were really popular, and I used those a couple times when Balázs, our gaffer in Hungary and Budapest on Moon Night, he's like, yeah, Greg, I don't like the colors, so I'm going to compare it to the Asteras. And he's like, we're like, yeah, these are better. Yeah, these are way better. Let's use those. So we found a bunch of those.
Were a little iffy.
Yeah, they were like this. It was very, well, there's way too many spikes in the color spectrum. for me, and the fringes of the bulbs, kind of like the pattern, be kind of weird, very punchy and really interesting. But these Asteras look great. Like there you get the nice kind of color response that their tubes have, and they were great ways to use like for small practicals. Like you need uplight on a column because they're also battery powered. So like plug them in, put them down, right? It's like it's a great, and you can make any color with them, and they're quite bright. And so we use them a lot in like the museum set, for example, or and location and that kind of thing. You could also build into sets now. Like that's like I haven't done like a sci-fi, something with built-in lighting since we've had this technology, and you could really, now with a lot of that stuff LED, you can have way more like control over making a mood. But it does bring in the bigger thing about what are the light sources for a scene. Like, is it going to be the window or is it going to be fire? Like, there's a lot of fire stuff in the Chamber of the Gods. It also helped bring out the gold color of some of the outfits and things. We had some cooler things, or there's some sodium color stuff like that sometimes outside, or it's or like I know I have to do a lot of cross shooting. I need the whole set to be. I need a set to kind of like to be self-lighting, and I'm less worried about creating a lot of contrast in the scene, other than the fact I know I got to shoot 3 cameras. I got like 6 pages of like it's going to be, and create something neat. Like there's like the pyramids in the Mogart set in episode 3 where they go to where the horse fight happens. Like the pyramids were like these incredible metal structures that Stefania built, and I was staring at them with these, and she painted all the entire inside of the pyramid structures gold, and I'm like, you know what? I don't want to like line all these things with like tubes. It's going to look a bit too Christmassy, but, and there's some tubes in some of the second unit work, which is just a mistake that they're on. But I thought it would be kind of cool if you get the light at the right angle and I shine it up, it'll probably kick off all these tubes, and it'll probably get enough light off of the framework if I light that quite bright, which will probably look good because the color is so intense that if I add gold light to them, I'll get enough stuff that'll create enough ambience, and then I can add a spotlight for the middle for the sarcophagus or whatever. Right. So to do that, I was like, well, then it has to be something bright. And it's like, okay, now we got to put. And so we ended up putting sky panels down there into the structure, and they were shining through a little narrow gap, but the gap was just at the right angle that it would still get all of the just in front of the structure. So that became, I could blast that really strong, and then the whole place lit up, and it just looked great in all the wide shots, and created enough stuff that it gave a nice hot background, a nice hot bit of gold behind and all the coverage, and created enough ambience as well. So it was like you could have basically, if I looked at me, you'd have a bright thing behind me, which could be nice little reflections off faces, but also it would create enough kind of ambience to the front that you could almost see, me. So it was actually kind of, it served 2 purposes, but there literally was like, light, ripping up, bouncing off all the gold structure, right? Became the light of the scene. Because also I needed something, because also it's a whole wall of mirrors to pyramid, right? So it's like you're not going to hide lights in the place, right? Because you're going to see them everywhere. I can't be hiding them all the time. It's easy to throw some black over the camera and crew members, but to be moving and covering lights all the time in a wall of mirrors is bad. So that was a good way to like build a light in for that scene, and that happens way more in those environments, I find, which is like what's kind of cool about it. What's the fun change of it, instead of just imitating daylight, which is something which also could be really great, then it's staging where your scene is, like is there a window or things like that.
Honestly, the majority of the DPs I've interviewed have espoused the joy of the Astera tubes, and I need them to sponsor this podcast because I've been doing it for free for too long. But
I know it's like they're great. They're really a great toy, a great tool, and there's nothing like watching someone walk across set, like walking across in their hand, and then suddenly it's on the board. Then like I'm at the board and I'm like, oh Christ, they're walking over there. Turn that one up.
Oh, the iPad app too. I mean, any wireless DMX, but just being able to dial it in off the iPad is such a joy now.
Saving a take or saving something by having an LED fixture or having either a combination of remote iris or being able to, tweak the brightness of something when something's going haywire, and maybe an actor's overshot their mark, or like something very unexpected happens and you need to adjust the lighting on the fly to save a take. It's like it's an incredible tool for that. And never mind just being able to do like camera moves and like, you know what, when they turn around, we'll just dumb those things out. And this is how we can get rid of the camera shadow. And something that's like, if I can just have them all in their own channels, then we can now do something where we're fluidly changing the lighting just to make the shot possible, to avoid the boom guy's shadow or the camera shadow or something else. And it's a fantastic tool.
Are you primarily using those in the sets, or are they all sometimes often used as keys? Are you modifying them at all? Because obviously, putting them in the set is like the classic way, but I've tried to use them as keys. Sometimes the Titans are pretty bright, but the older ones
Yeah.
weren't really that bright.
I've used them as key a couple times. So put, like we used to have we had a clip where you could put two of them in a row and a little spud, so you have like you have two of them together, instead of being like a Kino kind of harness. I've used them. We use them for firelight quite a lot, which is because there's a couple good fire cues you can use them on. And so if I have real fire in the scene, I need to add a little more. I'll put it on the ground next to the fire, or if I want to wrap it around more, or I've got the real fire there, and put some snow blanket on it. That's a great. We use that a lot actually in the Chamber of the Gods, for example, just to add more firelight. Put 2 or 3 on the ground to control them, and then again you can dim them when the camera goes the wrong way. We did a couple 360s in there around Harrow when he was raising Amit. And there's we'd track with the camera a little bit. And we use them for effects a lot. Like a lot of things, there's some magical effects in obviously Moon Knight where there's occasional times when there's sparkling blue magic or there's a magic fight or some things like that. And they're great for that because you can put them on the ground. If on interactive lighting on somebody's face for purple magic, I can put that down there. And even in a wide shot, if I need to paint it out, but as long as I keep it out of the person's overlapping the person, then VFX is pretty easy as a paint out because it's so small. And they really want some interactive light on them, but I can't get the interactive light. If it's a wide shot, I can't shine it across the set from 100 feet because it's going to be on and all the wrong way. If I want it to be between the two actors, you can put that on the ground, pick the right way to hide it, and create that. So it's very useful for that. It's great for what I'll often do is put them, let's just say I want to continue the light. Let's say we're in a parking garage or there's a column or something if I want to add a bit more light, just on somebody motivated from a window far away, but I don't have room for all that. I can hide the tube behind the column and just get a little bit of light on them, and it'll still feel like it's from the source farther away and make it soft enough. So they're great to hide for things like that. And those are the most ways I would use it. Normally, it's really as a single key, or unless it's to make a razor light type thing. You put some card on it to make it small, and you can put either. They even make those things now. They make little single tube. Almost like a soft grid honeycomb type thing, or make a razor light for it. And then it's to put a kick on something, because then it's be super small. I can hide it. It can go behind a piece of furniture, and I can light the ground with it or whatever. And it's a way to create accents on things and hide them very small. That's a really useful way to use them.
Sure. You actually just reminded me of a question I wanted to ask, and we'll make that the last one. So sure. I don't keep you forever.
Yeah,
we'll just have to have you back on because I'm sure we could go for another 2 or 3.
Oh yeah, I'll be happy to. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks for having such shedding such interest on this kind of things we do. Also, hopefully it's useful for people, especially some students that are watching.
Here's the thing, man. It's fucking useful for me. So
worst
case scenario, that's the thing is I've been doing these and I made the joke about not having sponsors or anything, but I've learned more in the past 2 years than I ever did at film school.
Yeah.
And if I'm a handful of times, it's been a case where I'm working on a project and I'm oh, great. I get to ask an ASC member what they would do.
Yeah.
And I will always, this is a little bit of how the sausage is made. I always make it sound like it's not me.
No.
For people who might be working on, I don't know, some really specific project. Yeah.
I've heard once this one problem that came up. No, but I think that's a great way to motivate it. Why? Because I've moderated, conversations myself for other things. And, I'm always there's questions I want to ask. There's, and there's then sometimes the most interesting because they're coming from a genuine, place of curiosity. Right. So,
yeah. Well, and my thought is always if I need to know this, someone else will need to know this. I have a note here that says all of my revelations, someone is known for far longer than me, so don't sound stupid. That's just a note that I have next to the camera. But it's also at a certain point, someone's got to know it. Anyway, the question I wanted to ask was, what are some things working on these VFX heavy shows like Moon Knight or Game of Thrones or whatever that, or even Watchmen to that degree, that maybe sort of everyone can use? The classic one that I say is split comps. Oh, we need to get a light or the microphone in closer. It's well, if you've got a locked off shot or a nodal shot, just walk the microphone out for a second, get that blank frame, and then you can just cut out, and it takes notes. You can do it in Premiere. You don't need a VFX background. What are some things maybe that you've learned on those shows that kind of maybe everyone can use with a little bit of post know-how?
Well, that's one. Also, but the thing about that is also on a bigger show, I can do that, but I gotta have to get approval to do that. I can't just do that on my own. I've got to talk to the VFX department because depending on their pipeline, everything else. Like there's
schedule.
That's one thing is like, for me, the big thing is to be involved as early as possible in anything that's going to be either like a, CG character or virtual environment or things like that. Cause it's an opportunity for me to use the ability to create an environment to help really create the mood I want for the scene. If I know we're going to be up against a fake sky or something like that, then, I want to control what that sky is. I want to be able to have an influence over what we do with the clouds and like what the look and feel of it is, because that's a big part of the look of the scene. And that allows me to, and the biggest thing is to appreciate one, talk to them as early as possible conceptually about any of those things, and then realize like, how you like the foreground affects the background, right? Like it affects both things. If I'm doing a virtual environment, then they will roll over the lighting I have on the person into the background, right? So it's like it's not, I know it sounds simple, but it's a team sport as far as building that look and making the VFX stuff seamless, right? And I think that's the biggest part of it. It's also going to be an incredible tool because it's like there's a great way, and it's like I say, you can really do something more extreme. It's like, hey, you know what if we did this? Like there's a way to me to change the mood of the scene by like, can you just, what if you erase all this? Or like, you know what I mean? There's ways that you can change the look of a location, right? Or things like that could be part of it. And you just don't want to have the whole VFX section being kind of separate from you. It should be all part of the same, conversation. I think it's really important.
Yeah. So for your shows, is VFX mostly like erasing equipment and set extensions? Are those kind of the two most common, or are there like other little kind of hidden things that are popping up?
Well, I mean, the set extensions will be a big thing in a like for a show with sets like Moon Knight, for example, because like, Chamber of the Gods, we built up to a certain point, then everything else above it, then in which case the environmental lighting I'm making for that set needs to kind of make sense with wherever they're going to extend, things like that. There's stuff in Cairo where we're like, okay, we're not going to shoot on the rooftops of Cairo, so we're going to build 2 rooftops and it's going to extend everything like that. So then I'm thinking about like, well, where should the sun be? I want it to be backlit because I want it to be a hot kind of like deserty thing, or let's say on the cliff scene in episode 3 as well was also like we built a cliff, but we didn't build, we were not in Cairo. So, that's more just like trying to plan about where the lighting is. Like there's a scene. Like when I did like some of the dragon flying scenes and Thrones, like after I finished my episodes, I'd stayed a couple times to do the Daenerys on the back of the dragon, and there was this great scene in season 6. When does she burn? When does she release her dragons? It's season 6. So is that season 6? I think no. Is it? Yeah, I can't remember now. I'm losing track. Anyway,
unfortunately, I'm gonna let you know I never saw the show.
It's okay. So well, anyway, there are
I'm
these
one of 4.
There are these 4 big dragons. Well, they start really small, but anyway, there's a bit in terms of the story. It's kind of a magical bit when there's all these stories about dragon riders and the people of the Targaryen heritage that she's from, because they're basically like, it's a medieval thing where you've got bows and arrows and swords, and it's like suddenly somebody's got an F-16. It's like, guess who's going to win the fight? So they can breathe fire. So there's a scene where like the first time she really like the dragon rescues her once at the end of season 5. That's right. So yeah, so in season 6, she gets on fully and she's flying around, and then 2 other dragons are kind of trapped, and she goes out there by herself and burns a bunch of these ships that were threatening her city and stuff like that. And it's a big like holy fuck you moment. Like, oh, I guess this is now, we've heard about this for 5 seasons, how people could do this, and this is like, it's a pretty spectacular moment, and it's for the character and also for the story, because it's like it's just changed the calculus of all of the politics and the power struggle in the show. But for her, it's also kind of moving. And so they VFX this sort of thing. And when Joe Bauer, who are a VFX supervisor, he's like, well, Greg, it's like, one, these things are really difficult. And because you did this amazing balcony scene last year, like I think you're one of the few people, that I know other than, Dean Selmer, who could ever pull this off. Very, very flattering, but also and I was like, well, can I really pitch like what the sky should look like? Because a couple of them will be virtual environments, because the city marine is obviously is not a real place. It's kind of like a weird mix of like a Cairo with pyramids and ancient Aztec architecture, and it's like it's a fantastical place in a dry environment. And he said, oh yeah, you can totally like design like what you want because I'm like what the dragons are doing is going to be set. But as far as like where the lighting is, I'm like, well, now it's kind of cool because now I can help make these shots look really neat. And there was a particular shot where we're kind of behind them and like they're banking, they're kind of going in for what's ostensibly an attack run where they're going to go burn these ships. And I thought it would be great to have the sun across certain way, because as they go with the shiny dragon wings, like the sun will like travel, like the reflection. It's very familiar to like Top Gun,
Right.
two F-14s, like that's the sun's shining on the wing. That's a bit similar. I just want to evoke that imagery, right? To evoke like the images of fighter planes and famous fighter plane movies, and as a way so I get to just help design that. And then I was like, oh, now I'm excited about this because now I'm contributing. This is not even my episode I shot. It's for an episode that Miguel Sapochnik directed and Fabian Wagner shot. But I was like, this is a way to I can help make this thing really cool and help do this. And then the same way that to put a real person on what's a CG character, entering the lighting is very important. So in one of the first shots, I was like, well, I feel like when the wings come up, because they're like, imagine like a big, like an eagle with a longer neck, like it's a big swooping thing. When the wing goes up, I want to put the sun away that the wing will shadow her, right? Which will then help make her like totally integrated into the scene. It won't look like a CG person stuck on a regular person stuck in a CG dragon. So the first couple of times I was like, well, I'll put the sun over there for that. I was just trying to think of all the things, all the tools I could use to make it interactive and more interesting. And I remember Steve Kullback, the producer, came in. He's like, what's that weird shadow going there? And I was explaining to him what I was doing. He just patted me on the back, like, that's fantastic. Like, because to him, it's like, this is one of the hardest things to do is to make this not look like, and like, it's all hinging on this, right? Like, we know the show is going to have more of these things. Like, we have to make this look great. We're all nervous about it. And so we just had, because the animation is when you're shooting a person on like essentially the motion base at the back of the dragon, it's kind of running in the program of the dragon, right? It's not like a separate thing. So the dragon's motion is all thing. The shots, previs with how the camera consistent. Moves. Yeah, it's like play. She's riding. So that way, when they cut her out, she'll go right onto the CG dragon, and it'll be totally like the thing she's touching is moving like the dragon. Right. And so that means I know when the wing is going, right? So now we could play. So we'd play the animation on a monitor in sync with it. So the guy, my poor electrician who's like, 80 feet in the air in front of the 20K sun with a
show card,
literally, yeah, with like, and he's watching it going like, and then down, and then like, and trying to get it in sync. We just once we worked out the timing, it's so ridiculous, right? But it was so much fun. And it was like, yeah, it really worked. Like there's that one shot. It's like two flaps, but man, it totally makes it believable. Which once you get the first shot right, the audience is like, more into it. And right. And that fighter plane shot was really cool. And so, I just tried to use all the tools to make that all the stuff as neat as possible to help reinforce the, what it was, the imagery it was supposed to evoke, and also just make it look cool. Cause it's like for the audience, it's like, they've been like in the scope of the story, because the big like cycle thing of like history and unreliable narrators. And so there's a lot of talk of like old wars and battles and stuff. And then as the characters age, the younger characters go into positions of power in the scope of the story. So when this happened, it's like, oh, we've heard about this shit. And like, it better live up to people's, imaginations of what they've been hinted at. Right. So, but it was just like a fun way to try and make it more integrated. And I think that's the biggest thing is like be involved early. As much as you can as cinematographer, any of the VFX or any of the any of the conceptual ideas, because even the ideas of like what the scene should look like, it's the same for me as being in prep with the director and the production designer. It's like, well, should we do it this way? Like, is this a better thing to do like all CG, or is this like, is it better if I build this part? Or it's like, you want to be involved as early as possible. In the same way that I want to be involved right up to the very end with color timing, because we do so many things, that we have to kind of like, push to the finish line. That's like me finishing the cinematography, right? Like I know I'm going to darken the wall over your head later because there was no way to do that at the time. And I want to know how to do that. And I think that's the biggest thing is be involved as early as possible and stick and go all the way through if you can.
Well, and to your credit about, the wing thing, I've been watching a lot more, or I have all these Cinefex manuals and been really interested in visual effects recently. And, the earlier VFX guys were always talking about like exactly like you're saying, like integrate. How do we make it look realistic, and finding like one or two things, like even on Terminator 2 or whatever, they're inventing the technology, and there's like one or two things that sell it. The idea of selling and not just having it be totally VFX. Yeah. Oh, VFX looks real or CGI looks realistic. It's like, but there's ways to integrate it so that it sells it.
Well, that's the thing about. I was going to say the one thing about that on Moon Knight, for example, is we have a lot of like characters that are going to be put in later, right? Like Tauret, Khonshu. And the big thing about those things is, we'll have a maquette as a reference, like a big Khonshu head or a big Tauret head. And that's a reference for many things, but also I will light the scene for that character. So I'm virtually lighting the thing that's not there, which sounds crazy, but because all that lighting affects, like if the Oscar walks through the same place, if I don't do that and they start doing the lighting, then they start doing lighting which doesn't affect him, which means suddenly it breaks the illusion that it's not a part. It's really important to light the thing that's not there. And it sounds completely crazy. Like I'm lighting the dragon that's not there and I'm lighting Khonshu that's not there, but it makes a huge difference to the ability of those things to really fit in. And also it makes me think about the lighting of the scene, right? Like Khonshu's got a big gray head. There's stuff in the chamber of the gods, like, oh yeah, I'm going to put the fire over here because I know he's going to look cool with the fire under his beak. And you're trying to and it makes a big difference because when they put that in there with the reference they have with the, gray and silver ball and HDR and everything else, they're a lot of it's like, wow, we're already 90% there, right? Like, it's like, I want to do the work for the CG character because also then I'm having control over the look and feel of the character in the scene, right? Which is part of the job of cinematographer. I just don't want to leave that up to other people that may not even be thinking what I'm thinking about that. It's part of the job.
Yeah. I mean, I had to read the quote, but you had said somewhere that like you should find out the first time that something was used. Like I think the example you gave was a moving camera, and then study why. And that's something that I've been trying to articulate for a long time. And you nailed it in one sentence. Cause I'm like, that's how you learn. You don't learn from reading the newest thing.
Yeah.
You figure out the first time they had to invent it, which is what I was getting at with the Cinefex and stuff. Figure out why they did that, because they're usually trying to figure out how to solve a problem that was earlier, and everything informs each other.
Cinefex, great publication. Great publication.
When they went out of business, I emailed them. I was like, "How many can you sell me?" I actually got a handful that they said they didn't have, but I bought so many that they were like, "We have some of these, like
we have Star a few Wars we can give you,
whatever." Yeah.
It's funny. There's a great, like, I stumbled across a YouTube channel. There's a documentary about model makers called Sense of Scale. If you go into YouTube and search for that, I think the company's Pierce Film Productions, but he's been basically releasing lots of the little short interviews from the stuff that didn't make the cut of the film. And it's all model makers from like the golden age of like, pre CGI stuff. And it's fascinating because you'll hear like the idea of like, well, I had to do this. And so I hadn't figured out like, it's really a whole bunch of people describing the art of model making and that they had to make or how they solve problems in certain films. And I think that's the thing. It's like the film. Like I was discussing with somebody else. Like the film. For example, I didn't figure out like when was the first match cut done in a swish pan. I don't know when that was, but like when like to bury a cut in a pan that you go quick enough that you can bury it in the motion. I don't know where that was, but I was like, oh, I know this technique. But I guess what I was talking about is there was just like remember that there's a purpose to those things, right? Like it's not because like when you're trying to come up with an idea, it's like, well, what's the goal? What am I trying to accomplish? Right? Like what is, and then that should lead you to like what the technique is that, you can sort of fit into it. Like we used every twinning technique we could on Moon Knight for sometimes for expedience, sometimes like I had to fit in, like, how do I need to do 3 cameras at once. 2 of them will be nodal pans. One's, on a techno dolly or whatever. But you're trying to do what the technique will give us the material that we need for the day. I just think it's interesting to find out that remember, like there's things we take for granted you forget are actually a tool. Like a close-up is a tool. Like it's a filmmaking tool, right? Like they're not going for the close-up. It's like, no, a close-up is actually has a purpose, right? In a filmmaking context, it's like it's a very different perspective to see someone's face really close. We see way more performance, everything else. And so like in the first beginning of the film, like it was like, oh, it's a tool. It's like I've shot of only one person. Like, what does that mean? Or like, I don't know what I'm seeing it. It's like, how the edit, like how you use a camera is like a tool, right? Like, handheld. They're all like, it's a specific tool which has an effect. And I think that's what I was trying to get at in that quote was like, remember that like these things have an effect and they have a reason to exist, right? It's like, what is it? What is that reason? It's a good, it's a refreshing thing to remember that there's a purpose to this and not just get lost and like, remember, it's another close up. It's like, no, should this be a close up, right? Like, remember it's a tool, that sort of thing. I find I can easily get in this, and especially in the heat of, like, shooting on a busy day, it's a bit, it's for me, the big battle is just not to get stuck in just like, pedaling the bike and forgetting where you're going. Right. It's like it's a lot of like moving quickly, but like, oh, wait a second, am I doing the right thing? And the people I really admire, like the cinematographers that I've known, is like the ones that I've witnessed working, and the ones I try to emulate, but I often fail in that way, is they are really thoughtful. Like it's a thoughtful process first, instead of just, pedal to the metal and like just don't stop looking, right? It's like it's almost like, just to bring it back, which just earlier, when you don't have a lot of time for a scene, you're behind. It's like the important thing is, first thing is, don't rush, and don't rush the decision for how you want to approach something. Because sometimes, just think about it for a second, like, well, do I need coverage in this? Like, no, maybe I don't. Like, what if they're, and like, everyone have an idea, but it's to be thoughtful, instead of like, hurry up, get the first shot going, right? The first AD is screaming at you, like, wait, I got the first shot going. And I'm like, well, let's just think about what shot we're going to do.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll only do one shot. Maybe it's like one in a pickup, or, it's like not to rush those decisions. Cause that's the thing that when I was younger, I would struggle with the most, is like to just like, the anxiety of like having a little time might get the better of me. And then I might be trying to rush too much to like force the decision, when now I'm much better at like, hold on a second. Let's just take a breath and like not panic, and then try and make a more thoughtful choice. Cause the more thoughtful choice will most often be the more memorable or better for the scene than what you just like speed ahead and just do exactly what we just did on the last scene. Even if you can do it quickly, it's like still like, now it just isn't the right thing for the scene, right? Or it's like trying to be thoughtful. I mean, the sort of like to keep myself on track with that when I was younger, the idea would be like, if I'm doing a scene, if like I need to think about it at least as long as it's on screen. So if like,
sure.
So you know what I mean? It's like sometimes you're over so quickly. It's like, if this is like two people talking for 8 minutes, better really think carefully about this, and also spend the time lighting this, because people are going to be staring at this for 8 minutes. Yeah. So if I make a quick decision, or we don't block it nicely, or get things in the right place to express what we want, I'm doing a terrible disservice, because this is 8 minutes they're staring at it, right? Sometimes it's like, they're putting a phone down. That's like, I can make it look pretty good, the right thing. That's something you burn through. You just get the take right, but it's not like you want to balance the focus you have and the consideration you have on how important it is to the story. Like, it doesn't have to be about the length of time it's on screen. Sometimes it's more the importance of the image. Maybe this image is used twice. Maybe it's the first and last shot of your film or something, but you want to balance the amount of consideration you take to it, and the design work, and also the execution accordingly, right? Like, you have to pick your battles, and I try and like remember, like, how important is this? And not to like burn through it. Because if you do that well, and you apply that, I find if I do have to, again, then I'm at some point where we're talking before, then suddenly I'm rushing for something, I know I do this quickly, but I'm still going to apply this idea of like, it's important. Let me just think about it a minute before I just rush into it. I'll still get to something I do very quickly, but I want the thinking to be like, hold on, what's going to be the right thing. And then often the thing you can do really quickly, it can be as thoughtful and as good looking as, everything else, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, and to the point of, thinking about the first time it was made, another thing that I suggest for people as from a studying thing is look at the films that came right before a new technology hit. Because one thing that's fascinating is like silent films right up until sound came out were pretty mobile. The camera was getting moved all over the place. The second they had to put that fucking 2-story blimp on it, everything was locked off.
It was basically in a phone booth the first couple. It was actually like a structured, like open the door, go in, and
it was a miniature house. So like if you want to study interesting early camera movement, look at right before audio came out, or like the 90s, right before like CGI was really available. A lot of those films are interesting to study now that they're vintage. The Matrix,
it's true.
That old film.
Oh yeah. It's like, it's really, I find that's like, I mean, also right once Steadicam came out, like suddenly Steadicam's using everything. It's a tool, right? It's a tool. It's not for everything. Gimbals are a tool, right? Split screens are a tool. It's like split diopters are a tool, things like that. Like that's actually there. We used a lot of those on Watchmen, for example, because it was, we were trying to get into, stacking the imagery in vertical planes, because like a lot of comic book panels, like there's no focus, right? No limited focus, right? So we were trying to use that composition, like, well, I can put the foreground object in there and the audience can now choose between where to look, which is like you could in a comic panel.
Split diopters just look cool.
Right. Or like we used to like the swing and tilt lenses for things like that too. But they're all tools. They just need to kind of be applied correctly, in the same way that, how you move a camera is a different character to it, right? Like handheld is different, like a handheld's different than Steadicam, right? Steadicam's different than, on a crane. And like, there's a lot of like how the camera feels in a scene, matters to me, and in terms of how we decide to do that. And you want to have like come up with a strategy that's really consistent and will help, the audience will kind of they'll feel like they're in secure hands with the storytelling, right? Like you are. The other expression I was like describing, like the camera operating thing, it's like you are, like we are taking their eyes and going, I got you now
by the ears.
Now, if I'm doing this to you, it's a choice, and I'm deliberately trying to shake and rattle you a little bit, like in the terms of the story. We are as filmmakers trying to do that in the same way that it's like it shouldn't just be a grab way to like increase tension if it seems inappropriate, or like the big mistake I see that I've been trying to get out of in my own work is like, for example, like if I want to have that energy, the problem is if I need the audience to see something very specific, small, don't move the camera too much, because, it's like people can't focus when the things move around like that. And you see that a lot sometimes. Like, I mean, that's just like the wrong way to do it. Cause like, if you want them to see it, they need to be able to see it. So, keep the camera more still to allow them to focus on it. If it's all motion blur, they can't tell what that is. And then suddenly we're cutting to a insert. Because in post, you're like, oh, you can't see it. Now we've added an edit to the scene, which we didn't want, because we shot in a way with the audience couldn't tell what the hell we were trying to show them. It's just like everything is a tool that way. So it's like, it's still so much to learn. I mean, we're talking for 2 hours, and I'm like, now I'm realizing, all right, there's a whole bunch of things I got to figure out before,
Well, you know what? When you learn new things, please come back and teach the rest of us, because I'm sure they'll be fascinating.
Oh, my pleasure. It's really fun chatting about it. Thank you very much. Really great to meet you. And I'd be happily come back anytime if I'm free. It's a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Frame and Reference is an Owlbot production. It's produced and edited by me, Kenny McMillan, and distributed by ProVideo Coalition. Our theme song is written and performed by Mark Pelly, and the F at Art Matbox logo was designed by Nate Truax of Truax Branding Company. You can read or watch the podcast you've just heard by going to provideocoalition.com or youtube.com/owlbot, respectively. And as always, thanks for listening.